What does it take to make a world? What sequence of tiny, indifferent motions of rock and light can conspire to produce a place that will, billions of years later, hold memory and language and the capacity to ask questions at all? This is the first question the voice of deep time poses. How does something vast and stable begin in an environment defined by fury and chance? In a region of space that would become the inner solar system, a thin, almost invisible cloud of dust and gas circled a young star. It was not an ordered structure, but a ragged, turbulent soup, the leftover flotsam of star formation. The narrator describes it not as silence, but as motion, particles tracing ellipses, eddies of vapor, microscopic stones colliding in a slow cosmic rain. Each grain carried the chemistry of older stars, iron and silicon, carbon and oxygen, atoms forged in distant furnaces and flung outward by ancient explosions. The process was unromantic in its particulars and sublime in its consequence. From these minute, anonymous pieces, a planet would assemble. The first scenes are granular, intimate. Dust motes encountered each other in micro-crashes. Electrostatic forces and van der Waals attraction made some stick. Over thousands of years, those clumps grew, their gravitational fields ever so slightly stronger, pulling in neighboring grains. The growth was not smooth. There were bursts of merging and long stretches of abrasive grinding. A pebble would catch another by chance, and for a fraction of a second become something else, a pair, a new center of pull. As these centers multiplied, they swept orbits clear, sculpted paths, and created a hierarchy of bodies, planetesimals, then embryos, then a dominant mass. The narrator lingers on the slowness and the inevitability, on how attrition relaxed into accretion. The adjective patient applies not to any consciousness, but to the arithmetic of gravity and motion. Millions of years of collisions concentrated mass until a single growing body began to dominate a region of the disk. Heat accumulated. Every impact delivered kinetic energy, and kinetic energy, when dissipated, becomes heat. In addition, short-lived radioactive isotopes, aluminum-26 among them, decayed within the forming ball, pouring energy into its heart. The planet's interior warmed, then, at a threshold, solid rock gave way to liquid. The narrator uses the word unmaking to describe this reversal, where once there had been discrete solids and empty space, there now existed a globe of incandescent matter. The newly born world was not a quiet sphere rolling through vacuum, it was a furnace. The surface was a ceaseless, furious liquid. A magma ocean covered the planet, its surface roiling and convecting like some vast, slow storm. There were moments, vividly rendered, when entire hemispheres glowed with incandescent plumes, when the sky was an expanse of molten reflection. Debris from further collisions skimmed the surface, exploding with flares of vaporized rock. The language used to describe these scenes stays rooted in observation, searing temperatures, incandescent flows, pressure gradients driving circulation. But within those descriptions, the narrator allows room for awe, the scale of the heat, the unrelenting violence, the fact that this incandescent phase is the crucible for everything that would follow. Differentiation, the segregation of heavy and light elements, began almost as soon as the interior could flow. Iron, denser and more prone to coalescence, sank toward the center. Silicates floated and formed a primitive mantle and crust. For the narrator, this is a moment of ordering amid chaos, a natural sorting that would later endow the planet with a core of molten metal. When that core stabilized, its motion generated a magnetic field. Empirically, magnetism is not poetry, yet the narrator insists on its profound consequence. An invisible shield appeared, a force that would in time protect a thin veil of gases from the star's uncaring wind. The implication is stark. Small differences early on have cascading effects across eons. The atmosphere of the newborn planet was not the pastoral blue sky of later epochs. It was thick, shrouded, and poisonous by any later standard. Outgassing from the magma and volatile rich planetesimals produced an atmosphere choked with water vapor, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, methane, ammonia, and traces of hydrogen and noble gases. There was little free oxygen. The oxygen that did exist clung to rocks or to volatile compounds. The narrator dwells on the sensory consequences in language aimed at the imagination. The sky was a perpetual twilight of vapor and soot, lit by the red-green glare of ionized gases and punctuated by lightning streaks born of colliding particles in turbulent convective currents. Lightning itself becomes a protagonist of sorts in the narrator's catalogue of processes. It crackled incessantly, fed by a dense atmosphere and the heat-driven updrafts above the magma ocean. Those electrical bursts were more than spectacle, they were chemistry at speed. The narrator describes them as the first chemical artisans, driving simple molecules into more complex arrangements. It is a gentle pivot towards speculation. From those early sparks, hydrogen recombining with carbon and nitrogen under the violent conditions of lightning rose, the first complex organics. The description avoids grand claims but opens the possibility. These energetic episodes seeded the planet with building blocks. Yet no single event defines the epoch. The narrator stretches scenes into cycles, epochs of heavy bombardment punctuated by lulls, periods when the magma ocean slowly convected and cooled, waves of vapor condensing, resisting, and sometimes collapsing back into steam under renewed heat. The late heavy bombardment emerges as a prolonged stanza of destruction. Asteroids and comets, remnants of the solar system's violent youth and displaced by planetary migrations, bombarded the planet with a tempo that could be described only as catastrophic. Each impact excavated the crust, injected heat, and reset local environments. The narrator treats these impacts not as discrete bullets, but as a cascade. Whole regions turned molten, debris thrown into orbit, transient atmospheres formed and stripped. There is a particular focus on the largest of these events, the giant impact hypothesis, which posits a collision between the proto-Earth and a Mars-sized body, often named Theia. That collision is described with cinematic rigor. The voice avoids sentimental personification, but the reader-listener is led through the physics with sensory verbs. A blinding flare when the bodies intersected, an impact that sent shockwaves through the planet's mantle, vaporized crust, and launched a ring of ejected material into orbit. For a time, tens to hundreds of years in human terms, this material circled the planet as a disk of incandescent rubble. Under the right conditions, that disk accreted into a single large satellite, the Moon. The narrator is deliberate about scale and consequence. The Moon's formation modulated the planet's axial tilt, influenced tidal regimes, and acted as a long-term stabilizer of seasonal rhythms. What is presented as a cataclysm thus becomes an act with quiet, profound after-effects. With the Moon's formation and with intervals of cooling, the planet's surface began to take on new textures. Steam in the atmosphere eventually condensed as the surface temperature dropped, slowly, over millions of years, permitting the accumulation of liquid water in basins and cradles. The first rain is described not in the pastoral terms of later climates, but as something elemental. Sheets of hot acid rain scouring nascent rocks, dissolving minerals, and transforming chemistry at the surface. Rivers, lakes, and shallow seas emerged as passive repositories of this altered chemistry. The narrator concentrates on the paradox of this scene, where life would later find its medium. There was then corrosive, burning rain and silicate-laden currents. The first oceans were born, not as placid mirrors, but as dynamic chemical reactors where mineral, heat, and organic compounds met. Throughout these sequences, the voice maintains a moral tone that is more philosophical than prescriptive. The early Earth is not portrayed as malignant nor benevolent, it is indifferent. That indifference, however, is not emptiness. It is a stacked set of probabilities turned into a unique trajectory. Tiny differences, an unusually high content of volatiles in the accretive material, the timing of a giant impact, the distribution of radioactive isotopes altered the odds. The narrator invites the audience to feel both humility and wonder at the contingency embedded in these processes. The idea that a specific set of accidents, repeated and strung across time, produced a world capable of later bearing witness to its own origin. If there is drama in this narrative, it is the drama of thresholds. The planet crossed thresholds repeatedly. Solid to liquid, unmagnetized to magnetized, dry to wet, poison to promise. Each threshold was a test and a sieve. What passed through them were materials and conditions, not intentions. The voice of the documentary keeps returning to the idea of scales, geological time-bending events into patterns, while at human scales the planet's infancy reads as instantaneous conflagration. That contrast is a recurring motif, intended to make listeners feel both the compression and expansion of time. The newborn planet's violent eras occupy short spans in geological terms, but are the long dawns that prepare the ground for life's eventual complexity. There are quieter sequences woven between the explosions. Layers of vesicular basalt began to solidify on cooler patches, trapping bubbles of primordial atmospheres beneath. These pockets became microenvironments where nascent chemical gradients could persist. Hydrothermal systems, fissures where hot, mineral-rich fluids met colder ocean water, created gradients of temperature and chemistry that the narrator identifies as potential cradles for complex chemistry. These scenes are described with sensory but restrained adjectives: sulfur-scented plumes in darkened ocean basins, mineral chimneys building like slow biological architecture, the persistent hiss of water meeting fire. Accompanying the geological account, the narrator introduces methodological introspection. How do scientists know this story? The voice gestures toward the evidence: isotopic ratios preserved in ancient minerals, the moon's orbit and composition, the distribution of siderophile elements, and computer simulations of planetary accretion. These points anchor speculation. They keep the narrative from drifting into wishful myth-making, reminding the listener that the sequence described is a reconstruction, a best-fit model, built from fragments. The narrator admits uncertainties, timing of late impacts, exact volatile budgets, the role of external delivery of water, and frames them as open questions that make the story live and unsettled. As the section approaches its close, the tone shifts from spectacle to implication. The narrator emphasizes that this birth was not merely formative, it was selective. The processes of temperature, pressure, chemical reaction, and orbital mechanics filtered possibilities. Some paths were closed forever, others were opened. The emerging planet, scarred and simmering, carried in its crusted layers the potential for emergence. The final paragraphs linger on the paradox of beginnings. From incandescent chaos arose the physical conditions that, over unbearable stretches of time, would permit the chemistry of life. This is not presented as teleology, but as a conditional promise, a set of conditions aligning to make emergence plausible, not inevitable. The concluding image is deliberately small and human-scaled, a single raindrop scalding as it falls into an acid pool on a cooled basalt plain. From a listener's vantage, that drop conveys paradox, both annihilation and the beginning of assembly. The narrator leaves that image suspended, asking, without expecting an answer, what other sequences of collisions in chemistry might have produced different histories. The voice returns once more to the initial question, what does it take to make a world? And then narrows the focus. What did this particular set of motions and materials at this particular time allow? The answer is not clean. It is layered and incremental. It is, in a word, promise. Throughout the sequence, the voice keeps the listener aware of scale and contingency, of how the great dramas of planet birth are ultimately composed of trivialities. Dust grains, radioactive decay, a stray impactor nudged into a different orbit. The narrator underscores a final, quiet lesson. The Earth's infancy, for all its ferocity, established the grammar of a long story, one that would, over billions of years, bend toward complexity and, for a brief moment in cosmic time, produce beings who could narrate the tale. The perspective is not celebratory, but reflective, tailored to produce in the listener a sense of being small in a vast chronology and, simultaneously, part of a chain that began in fury and cooled into possibility. This is the end of the first chapter of the planet's life, an account of assembly through fire, of chaos disciplined into layers, and of the first feeble arrangements of chemistry and energy that would, in time, make life conceivable. The narrator does not promise certainty for what comes next. It hints only at the slow, patient transformations, cooling, shielding, watering, that will set the stage for chemistry to turn into biology. The final tone is one of suspended expectation, a quiet insistence that out of torrid beginnings the conditions for life were forged, and that this forging will be the premise upon which the rest of the story depends. What happens when two worlds, each indifferent and enormous, intersect in a way that rewrites the architecture of time? What does a single collision do not only to shape surfaces and orbits, but to rearrange the possibilities of chemistry and climate for a planet yet unnamed by anyone who might one day notice it? The answer begins in a theatre of brute mechanics and quiet arithmetic. A body roughly the size of Mars, given the convenient name Theia by later interpreters, met the growing Earth in an encounter that was neither melodrama nor accident in human sense, but the inevitable outcome of a system still sorting itself. The narrator observes this not as a tale of characters, but as the movement of mass and momentum. Two aggregates on crossing trajectories, the larger shepherding the smaller into an embrace whose force was measured in energies that, if translated into language, read like heat, vapor, and light. The collision, the giant impact, was a punctuation mark of extremes. Where there had been separate centers of gravity, there became, for the space of an instant, an undifferentiated event. Shock waves compressing mantle, crust flaring into vapor, molten plumes lofting into ballistic trajectories that would neither return nor remain scattered. The immediate image is blinding. A flare brighter than any sunlit surface flashes around the combined bodies, rock becomes gas, metals are liquefied and then centrifuged into new arrangements. The immense energy delivered by Theia's strike was converted into motion outward. An incandescent disk of debris circled the remnant world. That ring was not permanent, but it was consequential. In the quiet analysis that follows the cinematic description, the narrator shifts to scale. The disk lasted long enough by geological measure to accrete. Gravity, patient and indifferent, caused those fragments to collide, to stick, to damp relative velocities. Chunks merged into larger fragments. Larger fragments shepherded smaller ones. In a relatively brief epoch measured in years to centuries, a single dominant satellite condensed. The moon took shape out of the debris, a companion formed of the same violent soil as the Earth, a body whose mass, orbit, and timing would imprint rhythms upon the planet's future. That imprint is tangible and paradoxical. The moon is an artifact of destruction that introduces stability. Its early orbit was far closer, its tides far larger. In those first eons, a moon hugging the planet raised tides that churned basins into relentless mixes. The narrator dwells on the irony. The same event that stripped and scattered material also created a mechanism that would regulate day length, stabilize axial tilt over long spans, and by doing so modulate climate in ways that mattered to chemical progress. The voice is neither celebratory nor moralizing. It insists on contingency. Without that companion, seasons might have been wild, obliquity oscillations greater, climates less reliable, and the permutations of chemistry different. Thea's violence had become, through the patient calculus of orbital dynamics, a necessary precondition for certain futures. Evidence for this reconstruction is not purely speculative. The similarity in oxygen isotopic ratios between the Earth and the Moon suggests a common origin, or thorough mixing. Lunar samples show deficits and enrichments that are consistent with an origin in material that once belonged to the Earth's mantle. Computer models, refined with better constraints on energy and angular momentum, recreate plausible sequences leading to a moon of our mass and distance. These are not narrative certainties, but best fit histories, models that press against fragments of real data and say, this is how it could have been. The aftermath of the giant impact was a long slide from incandescent chaos towards something that could be called temperate. The narrator returns to the small, stubborn details that matter. Heat redistributed, radiating into space over millions of years. The magma ocean that had encrusted vast swaths of the surface began incrementally to quench. As the planet cooled, volatile compounds, water vapor, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, sulfur species escaped from the molten interior and from heated rocks. The early atmosphere swelled with these gases, thick and heavy, a dense shroud that trapped heat and delayed cooling even as it set the stage for later condensation. Rain, of a sort radically different from any later pastoral notion, began to fall. But not all at once, and not as a gentle blessing. The first precipitation was a slow process, a collapse of a steam-dominated atmosphere as radiative losses outpaced heat input. For millions of years, the sky poured in sheeted deluges and in scorching bursts. The narrator dwells on the physical sensation of that epoch by invoking scale. The sound of continuous rain falling on an ocean of molten rock would have been the sound of steam and sizzle, of vapor rising where drops hit red stone. The little image that closed the previous chapter, the scalding raindrop in an acidic pool, reappears here, expanded into fields and basins where countless drops scalded, dissolved, and altered. Those rains were not merely erosive, they were chemical sculptors. Hot, acidic water leached minerals from fresh volcanic crust, carrying dissolved iron, silica, phosphorus, and trace metals into nascent basins. The first oceans were not blue glass, but roiling chemical cauldrons, opaque, heavy with suspended particulates, layered with temperature and composition gradients. Where hydrothermal upwellings met colder layers, mineral precipitation formed chimneys and mounds, structures that in later ages biology would mimic, but here existed as pure geochemical phenomenon. The narrator emphasizes that complexity can arise without life. Structured gradients, steady fluxes, and persistent interfaces are the natural outcomes of non-equilibrium systems. It is in these gradients that the narrator situates the first significant plausibility for prebiotic chemistry. They are not scenes of life, but of potential. Hydrothermal systems provide redox gradients, differences in chemical potential that can do work on molecules. The combination of dissolved iron and sulfur, the catalyzing surfaces of newly formed clays, the energy of thermal vents and lightning in the upper atmosphere, all of these are mechanisms by which simple molecules can be rearranged into more complex forms. The narrator resists grand claim, instead sketching the architecture of possibility: formation of simple organics from atmospheric chemistry, concentration of those organics on mineral surfaces, polymerization encouraged by cycles of wetting and drying in tidal zones, and energy input from ultraviolet radiation and geothermal flux. Each is a plausible step in an unwritten sequence that could, given further fortunate conditions, lead toward the chemistry of life. Tides powered by the nearby moon are given particular theatrical attention. They created repeated exposure and desiccation of shorelines. Pools left behind by a receding tide were natural concentrators. Molecules that would dilute in ocean waters could become concentrated on rock surfaces as water evaporated, enabling reactions that would not proceed in highly diluted conditions. The narrator lists these processes with a sense of accumulating probability rather than inevitability. Tidal pumping, wet-dry cycling, mineral surface catalysis. Each small process increases the odds that assembly of complex polymers could occur somewhere in the mosaic of environments the planet offered. Evidence that liquid water existed early is fragile, a set of whispers rather than a chorus. Ancient zircons, tiny crystals preserved in the oldest rocks found on Earth, carry isotopic signatures that suggest interaction with liquid water at the time they formed, thus implying that at least patches of the surface had cooled sufficiently to hold water as early as 4 billion years ago. Those grains are a window into a deep past and a reason to take seriously the possibility that oceans, even if ephemeral or local at first, existed in tandem with the slow cooling of the crust. The narrator keeps returning to contingency, small shifts in timing or quantity change outcomes. If the moon had formed with 1% more mass, tidal forces would have been stronger. If volatiles had been more scarce, oceans might never have pooled. A slightly different distribution of radioactive isotopes might have prolonged the magma ocean by tens of millions of years. The point is not to enumerate all the near misses, but to impress upon the listener that the pathway to temperate seas required an alignment of many independent processes. The language used here carries an almost moral weight, but the narrator is careful. The universe does not prefer anything. It produces outcomes by the arithmetic of probability, and life, if it were to arise, would be a consequence of that arithmetic in one particularly favorable sequence. The early biosphere's prospective cradle was diverse: deep-sea vents with their chemical disequilibria, tidal flats with their cyclical concentration, porous basalts that trapped nutrient-laden fluids, aerosol-laden skies where radiation might create unusual molecular species. The narrator paints each environment vividly, but always as a scene of chemistry. In the vents, mineral chimneys exhale sulfurous plumes that precipitate iron sulfide. On tidal flats, cracked mats of mineral salts glint in a hot sun. In sheltered basins, dissolved organics are sheltered from dilution. Each locale offers a different pathway to molecular complexity. Amid all this, the moon's slow outward migration remains an understated background actor. As the satellite receded, day length increased, tides weakened, and the balance between mixing and isolation shifted. That migration, a product of tidal friction, was gradual but consequential. It altered the tempo of environments. What had been a world of pounding tides matured into one with gentler cycles. From the narrator's vantage, this metamorphosis is another demonstration of how initial, violent conditions can gestate long-term stabilizers, elements that do not stop change but channel it. Throughout the account, the voice is careful to mark where speculation ends and inference begins. Isotopic data, lunar samples, and dynamical models constrain the broad strokes. But the details of where and how chemistry took the next step into biology remain conjectural. The narrator uses this uncertainty as a feature, not a flaw. It is in the gaps that imagination and hypothesis must operate, guided by what is known. The result is a tapestry woven of hard evidence and cautious inference. A planet struck into a new state, cooled enough to let steam condense, rained upon until basins filled, and stirred by tides and heat into a landscape of gradients and catalysts. The emotional contour of the narrative moves from spectacle to hush. The initial collision is a blinding, furious moment that rewrites orbits and material budgets. The subsequent epochs are slower, marked by patient chemical interactions and the accumulation of small, persistent differences. The narrator frames this progression in human terms of feeling, awe at the scale, unease at the randomness, and a modest hope that such a turbulence could yield conditions hospitable to complex chemistry. Yet these are not human hopes imposed upon nature. They are the human reactions provoked by an indifferent arithmetic that happened once to favor an outcome luminous enough for beings to one day ask questions. The chapter closes, as the previous did, on a small image that carries disproportionate weight. A single droplet, newly condensed from a cooling sky, falling into a shallow pool rimed with dissolved minerals. The drop sizzles. In its brief, percussive life, it dissolves and deposits, carries and spreads, participates in a conversation of molecules that will continue long after any single sound fades. In that tiny event, the story of collision and cooling, of molten rock and patient rain, condenses into a moment of interaction between heat, surface, and chemistry. It is both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because countless drops fell for millions of years. Extraordinary, because some fraction of those interactions nudged the planet a little further along, a path that, eventually, and against staggering odds, allowed complexity to assemble. The narrator does not claim a clean conclusion. The formation of the moon and the slow birth of oceans do not explain life. They set boundaries and create opportunities. They are not guarantees but possibilities, and the story that follows will depend on how that nascent chemistry fared within the crucible of tides, lightning, and mineral surfaces. For now, the scene ends with the rain and the cooling, with the moon rising as a new bright companion in a sky still thick with vapor. A reminder that the world's violent adolescence had, in becoming quieter, opened rooms in which strange and improbable chemistry might, someday, persist long enough to write itself into something like memory. What is the smallest thing that can be said to make a world feel alive? That question, asked again and again by the patient voice of deep time, narrows in this chapter to a single urgent observation. For most of Earth's history, the actors on its stage were invisible to the naked eye, and yet their collective breath would rewrite the chemistry of the planet. The voice of the narrative does not begin with people or names, but with a thought image. A membrane no thicker than a soap film, trembling at the edge of a warm mineral pool. For an instant, it is a separate physics, a tiny boundary that keeps inside what might fall apart outside. That membrane is not life itself in any finished sense, but it is one of the crucial steps by which chemistry begins to claim stubborn persistence. From that modest start, something enormous will follow. The earliest scenes of biology are scenes of chemistry arrested into habit. In the warm, mineral-rich pockets, fissures along the seafloor where hydrothermal fluids exhaled heat and dissolved metals. Organic molecules assembled and reassembled, sometimes by chance and sometimes under the coerced aid of surfaces. Clay minerals with layered sheets acted like primitive lab benches. They concentrated amino acids and nucleotides, aligned them, and nudged the first longer chains into being. The narrator dwells on those surfaces as quiet laboratories. There is no drama in the human sense, only the slow, repetitive work of collisions, adsorptions, and bond formations. But the result is a kind of cumulative insistence. Repetition trumps uniqueness. Cycles produce stability. Two broad families of origin stories linger in the margins of this era. One that privileges genetics, nucleic acids, attaining information-bearing replicative capability early on, and another that privileges metabolism, networks of redox reactions forming self-sustaining chemical cycles first, with information emerging later. The voice refrains from picking a champion. Instead, it treats both frameworks as plausible architectures, each taking advantage of the planet's uneven landscapes. In warm, sheltered pools where evaporation and wet-dry cycles concentrated molecules, short polymers might have been forced into new configurations and stabilized by forming bonds. In the dark chimneys of hydrothermal vents, the flow of reduced iron and sulfide against oxidized seawater supplied a continuous flux of energy, a far from equilibrium condition in which proto-metabolic networks could persist and copy their patterns into different substrates. What matters, the narrator insists, is not which hypothesis is correct in absolute terms, but that the planet offered many ecological niches that could host these processes simultaneously. There were puddles baking at the margin of tidal flats, subject to the moon's omnipresent tug. There were porous basalts that trapped nutrient-rich fluids and created long-lasting pockets of concentration. There were vent systems where thermal and chemical gradients produced stable, exploitable disequilibria. The narrative stitches these niches together into an archipelago of opportunity. In those places, self-assembling lipid-like molecules formed compartments, protocells, tiny enclosures that produced local chemistry different from the surroundings. The imagery is deliberately microscopic. The narrator invites the listener to imagine a lipophilic sphere folding over, pinching to separate, and in the process carrying with it a mixture of RNA-like strands and catalytic minerals. Each division is a low-probability event, but there are incalculable numbers of trials. Natural selection, at its most basic, is a filter. Those structures that keep reproducing, incubating useful reactions, and persisting longer in a given niche begin to dominate by simple arithmetic. The scale is forbiddingly slow by human standards, but explosive in cumulative effect. Small advantages, replicated across eons, accrue into novel capacities. The first true fingerprints of life that survive in rock are faint and contentious, yet they sing a persistent song. Isotopic signatures, slight enrichments of carbon-12 relative to carbon-13, appear in ancient graphite and suggest fractionation by biological processes as far back as 8 billion years ago in some records. Layered, microbially induced structures preserved in ancient sedimentary rocks. The stromatolites discovered in the Pilbara Craton and in the Barberton Greenstone belts show patterned lamination consistent with biological mats trapping and binding sediment. The narrator treats these clues like letters burned into stone, fragmentary, ambiguous, but insistently suggestive. Each fossil, each isotope ratio is a sketch of someone who existed long ago, but that someone was a colony, a mat, a chemical consortium, not an individual animal with a name. Those microbial mats deserve a longer examination. They were living carpets that grew across shallow sea floors and inside tidal pools, gluing sediment into layered lumps. In sunlight, many mats were dominated by organisms that could harness photons, primarily bacteria. But not all photosynthesis was created equal. Long before oxygen became a planetary commodity, bacteria practiced anoxygenic photosynthesis. They absorbed light but used molecules like hydrogen sulfide instead of water as electron donors. The narrator draws a careful contrast. These early phototrophs were efficient, local converters of radiant energy into chemical gradients, but they left no free oxygen in their wake. Then, at some point, perhaps multiple times, perhaps once in a fortuitous molecular rearrangement, bacteria evolved a way to split water as an electron source, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. The emergence of oxygenic photosynthesis, almost certainly in the lineages that would later be called cyanobacteria, is treated in the narrative as a threshold event, not immediate in its planetary consequences, but decisive over geological time. The voice explains the chemistry with clarity. The splitting of H2O requires robust biochemical machinery and powerful oxidation. Reduction chains, a molecular toolkit that allowed sunlight to be paired with water, the planet's most abundant resource. The first cells capable of this were not giants. They were microscopic engineers whose cumulative respiration would, through patient persistence, transform an atmosphere. For hundreds of millions of years, Earth's surface was a patchwork of microenvironments and metabolic strategies. The narrator sketches a day in this world in small, evocative vignettes. Morning light skims across a shallow lagoon, stimulating mats of photosynthetic bacteria. A tide retreats, leaving salt-rimmed pockets where wet-dry cycles bind nucleotides and form longer chains, deeper under the water. Chemolithotrophic organisms oxidize sulfur and iron, spewing out mineral precipitates that settle and embed biological textures into rock. Each scene is densely physical, tastes of iron, sulphurous hiss of vents, the opaque glare of particulate-rich waters. There is no drama in the human sense, but there is a kind of inevitability, a slow choreography of energy flows. As oxygenic photosynthesis spread, its first effects were local and quickly absorbed by the planet's sinks. Free oxygen was a reactive gas. It combined with dissolved iron in the oceans to form iron oxides that precipitated out and sank, forming the banded iron formations, BIFs, that would, billions of years later, become the planet's rich iron ore deposits. The narrator lingers over this fact because it is visceral proof of life modifying its environment. Microscopic metabolism, leaving a planetary ledger. Those BIFs, thick sequences of alternating iron-rich and silica-rich layers, stand as testimony to a period when oxygen was continually produced and quickly consumed, a world in which oxygen's presence was etched into sedimentary layers rather than broadcast into the sky. There is drama here, but it is chemical and cumulative. The narrator stresses thresholds again. As oxygen production outpaced sinks, if enough oxygen was liberated faster than iron, reduced sulfur, and volcanic gases could remove it from the atmosphere. The concentration of free oxygen in the air would begin to rise. The Great Oxidation Event, around 24 billion years ago, is the story's looming climax in this chapter. It is less a single instant than a series of graduations. Oxygen begins to trickle into shallow waters, then persists, then accumulates, then flushes into the atmosphere. The consequences are enormous and paradoxical. Oxygen is a toxin to many metabolic lineages that evolved in its absence. Its rise likely precipitated an extinction of anaerobic communities. At the same time, it opened the door for oxidative metabolisms that yield far more energy per unit substrate, metabolisms that would later be co-opted by organisms that grow larger and more complex. The narrator does not romanticize oxygen's ascent. It frames the event as a planetary experiment with winners and losers. The voice pauses on the irony. Life itself manufactured an agent that would restructure its ecosystems, one that would both annihilate long successful biochemistries and create new energetic possibilities. This is a motif the narrative returns to frequently, the non-teleological irony of emergent consequences. Small innovations in metabolism can, when summed across billions of cells and millions of years, rearrange the chemistry of seas and skies. There are other large-scale consequences to consider. As oxygen rose, methane, an abundant greenhouse gas produced by methanogenic microbes, was oxidized more readily, reducing its atmospheric concentration and cooling the planet. Geological records point to glaciations roughly coincident with episodes of oxygen increase. The Huronian glaciation is often invoked as a candidate for an early, long-lasting freeze. The narrator treats this intersection of biology and climate as a sober reminder. Life does not merely adapt to a planet, life can alter the climate and the very conditions that allow it to persist. Through all this, genetic and ecological innovation continued in the microbial world. Horizontal gene transfer blurred the boundaries between lineages, shuffling biochemical capabilities across community networks. Metabolic pathways recombined, retooled, and occasionally gave rise to entirely new strategies for harnessing energy. Microbial mats became complex, layered ecosystems where syntrophic partnerships, organisms that exchange metabolites, enabled persistence in a variety of niches. The early biosphere was, then, not a collection of isolated organisms, but a networked, cooperative, and competitive web, where metabolic cooperation sometimes proved more stable than solitary prowess. The emotional tenor of the narrator shifts carefully. The wonder is constant, but so is a kind of humility. These transformations are not triumphs of intention, but the predictable outcomes of chemical regimes exposed to energy flows. The narrator invites awe at the scale of microscopic work colonies of bacteria reshaping continents' chemical deposits, and at the deep contingency of the outcomes. Different initial conditions, different timings of oxygenic photosynthesis, different abundances of volcanic gases could have produced a planet with a very different atmosphere, perhaps never one hospitable to complex life. The voice refuses to claim inevitability. Instead, it frames the path as a set of open doors and closed alleys. The chapter closes, as others did, on a small, precise image. This time, it is a sunlit ripple across a shallow microbial mat. In the thin film of water, photosynthetic bacteria shine faintly, their pigments catching the sunlight. Sediment grains, bound together by slime and filaments, make a tiny mound. A single grain, trapped and cemented, becomes permanent when mineral precipitates harden the mat's surface. Over seasons and centuries, many such mounds accumulate into layered stromatolites, macroscopic records of microscopic life. The narrator lingers on the tactile quality of this image, the slickness of the mat, the muted, greenish shimmer of cells at noon, the faint hiss as oxygen bubbles rise and break. It is an ordinary scene repeated 1,000,000 times, yet it is extraordinary in consequence. Microscopic processes that would, in time, reach up into the air and change the planet's atmosphere. Part 3 of the story, then, is not a tale of sudden awakening, but of cumulative insistence. Life begins as marginal chemistry made persistent, as compartments that reproduce imperfectly but enough to let selection act. It spreads through metabolic experimentation, through the exploitation of gradients and energy flows. It invents and discards strategies, sometimes with planetary consequences. By 2.5 billion years ago, the microbial world had established many of the core pathways that would scaffold all later biology. The narrator closes with a tempered question rather than an answer. Standing at the edge of the era that ends with the Great Oxidation Event, one can ask not whether life was inevitable on this planet, but how many different forms of planetary life might have been possible if a single membrane, membrane had been a different thickness, a different distribution of minerals had been present, or the timing of light and tide had shifted by a few tens of millions of years. The story remains an open ledger written in carbon, iron, and the slow accretion of countless tiny, persistent processes. What is the sound of life deciding to become visible? The question hovers like a spark in the long dark between epochs, a single idea that opens this chapter. Had life been whispering beneath the waves for 1 billion years, what made it begin to shout? The Cambrian explosion, a geological blink that becomes an orchestral crescendo when seen from the patient distance of deep time, answers not with a single cause but with a chorus of converging conditions. It is a story of thresholds crossed, of ecological games suddenly gaining new rules, of bodies discovering armor and teeth, and of the seafloor transforming from passive stage to a field of active engineering. For hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian, the Earth had rehearsed the possibility of complexity. Microbial mats stitched sediments into layers. Simple multicellular clumps experimented with cooperation. Eukaryotic cells acquired organelles and the rudiments of division and differentiation. The Great Oxidation Event had put oxygen into a planetary ledger. Later fluctuations, long stretches of relative stability, and incremental rises in atmospheric and oceanic oxygen created an energy landscape that could sustain more expensive metabolisms. But energy alone is not an explanation. The Cambrian's sudden proliferation of forms, trilobites with jointed exoskeletons, sponges with internal canals, mollusks with creeping feet and hardened shells, required a confluence of physiological possibilities, ecological opportunity, and the evolutionary inventions of development and behavior. Imagine a shallow sea that has spent eons as a quiet, soft world, beds of microbial film, the occasional fronded Ediacaran holdfasts swaying with slow currents. Into that domain, small but important changes seep. Ocean chemistry becomes richer in calcium and phosphate, conditions favorable to precipitation of mineral hard parts. The first scene of Cambrian life is not a sudden parade of polished shells, but a series of intimate experiments. Tiny animals begin to precipitate minerals on and within their tissues. Some coat their outer surface with a thin, mineralized layer. Others build defensive spicules or stiffened plates that permit leverage for muscle attachment. The planet, which had long tolerated a soft-bodied ecology, now hosts bodies that leave durable signatures. Trilobites appear as one of the era's most emblematic experiments. Not a single creature, but an entire lineage playing a structural game, segmented bodies edged by articulated exoskeletons. In the shallow, suspended light, a trilobite's world is a lateral scroll of sensory and mechanical engagement. Its compound eyes, built from numerous calcite lenses, refract the watery glare into a mosaic of motion detection. A trilobite crawls across soft sediment with a methodical choreography of many legs, each segment engaged in a repeatable rhythm. When it molts, measurement of time becomes literal. The animal must choose a moment to split its plated shell, push out, and leave the empty carapace as a ghostly shell on the seafloor. Molting is a delicate gamble, necessary for growth, dangerous because of exposure. The moments before and after a molt are scenes of vulnerability and consequence, where predation risk and shelter-seeking reorganize behavior. The fossil record preserves not only the durable carapaces, but the echoes of these life cycle choices, the result of bodies suddenly committed to an architecture that trade-offs flexibility for protection. Elsewhere in the same waters, sponges continue to make a quiet, profound living. They are not the glamorous headline animals, but their presence is foundational. By filtering vast amounts of water, sponges become agents of clarity and nutrient cycling. Their internal canal systems channel currents that sort microscopic particles from seawater, concentrate microbes, and redistribute organic matter across microhabitats. Some sponges develop mineral spicules, skeletal needles that, once shed and buried, help compose the growing mineral record. The narrative here is an economy of flows. Water moving through a sponge is not merely sustenance, but an act of environmental engineering. Over time and at scale, dense sponge communities rearrange light penetration, particle fluxes, and the chemistry of boundary layers on the seafloor. Mollusks enter this theatre with different strategies. Imagine a soft-bodied animal bearing a muscular foot, dragging itself with a slow and sure force across a surface, rasping with a radula at algae films or microfauna. Some mollusks secrete shells, curved, smooth, or ornately ridged, that become microarchitectures of defense and hydrodynamics. The shell is both tool and identity. It shelters a soft interior and defines ecological possibility. A shelled mollusk can survive encounters that would kill a non-mineralized competitor. It can explore surfaces with new boldness. The ecological cascades are immediate. Grazer pressure increases on bacterial and algal films, sediments are stirred, and nutrient pathways shift. The Cambrian world is not static, it becomes kinetic in a new way. Burrowing intensifies. What had once been a largely undisturbed sediment now hosts a multitude of tunnels. Vertical shafts, horizontal meanders, three-dimensional faunal gardens. These trace fossils, ichnofossils, announce an important behavioral innovation. Bioturbation changes aeration of sediments, alters redox conditions, and redistributes organic matter. The seafloor's chemistry is no longer a passive record of deposition, but an active product of animal behavior. Burrows are both evidence of new ecological interactions and mechanisms that further transform the environment, establishing feedback loops in which life engineers its own niches. Predation changes the stakes. Before the Cambrian, feeding often meant grazing on microbial films or passive filter feeding. With the spread of hard parts and predatory strategies, new opportunities for energy capture arise. Slices and bites leave marks in the fossil record. Repair scars on shells tell of encounters survived. The emergence of eyes and more complex nervous systems reforms behavior at a fundamental level. Vision provides information at a distance. A flicker in the light becomes the difference between seizing an unwary prey and being seized. The arms race metaphor is apt, not because evolution aims for escalation, but because selection favors adaptations that increase survival and reproductive success in an environment of reciprocal pressures. Defensive armor begets better grasping limbs. Better grasping limbs favor more effective armor. Over time, escalation yields a richer morphological variety. The Burgess Shale and China's Changjiang beds stand as windows into this bewildering proliferation. Their exceptional preservation captures not merely the rigid bits but soft outlines, limbs, gut tracts, sensory appendages, allowing a rare glimpse into body plans once lost to ordinary fossilization. These deposits record an inhabited world of forms that defy simple categories. Strange lobopodians with ambiguous appendages, armored arthropods, enigmatic frond-like creatures anchored to substrates. From these strata, the listener perceives a Cambrian sea as both familiar and alien, a domain of experimentation, where natural selection explored developmental possibilities with abandon. Underlying morphological novelty is a subtler revolution, changes in developmental regulation, the emergence and elaboration of genes that control body patterning. Genes that can switch segments, define limb positions, and produce repeated motifs. provide a generative toolkit. To imagine this is to imagine not a single invention, but a modulation of capacities, small regulatory changes that cascade into new morphologies. A tweak in gene expression can elongate an antenna, add a joint, or change the pattern of shell secretion. When such changes are filtered by survival and reproduction, new body plans become stabilized. The result is a profusion of architectures, each a solution to local ecological realities. But the Cambrian burst is not merely a story of anatomy and genes. Ecology plays a central role. Niches multiply when animals alter habitats, predators, open niches that favor social behaviors, hiding strategies, and mobility. Communities become structured in layers: surface-dwelling grazers, subsurface miners, suspension feeders, ambush predators. Food webs, once diffuse and dominated by microbes, become more intricate. Energy is channeled through more trophic levels, and with more pathways, ecological complexity increases. This is a world that generates its own opportunities. As predators become efficient, scavengers and decomposers evolve to exploit leftovers. As bioturbators stir sediments, microbial communities adjust. As suspension feeders filter, particulates and nutrients are redistributed. The narrative here never lets the listener forget contingency. Fossil assemblages that we call explosive are partly the product of better fossilization. Mineralized tissues preserve where soft bodies do not, and partly the product of genuine evolutionary experimentation. The Cambrian explosion reads dramatic in the fossil record because it coincides with the rise of tissues that fossilize. But fossil richness aside, there is no single teleology. Cambrian innovation was a contingent ripple overlaid on environmental and genetic currents. Different chemistry, slower genetic innovation, or an absence of certain ecological pressures could have muted the burst. The narrator insists that the explosion was an alignment of influences: oxygen adequate to support demanding metabolisms, seawater chemistry permissive of hard parts, developmental systems flexible enough to produce novelty, and ecological interactions that favored diversification. Throughout this era, the planet exhibits a peculiar tension. Novelty begets instability, and instability begets opportunity. A newly armored trilobite might blunt the spread of one predator while opening space for another specialist. An efficient filter feeder can reduce plankton levels, which in turn affects microbial loops. The Cambrian Sea is a dynamic tableau of feedbacks, where short-term advantages ripple into long-term consequences. The planet's history is neither purely cumulative nor simply random. It is a braided stream of selection, physics, and chance. There is also a quieter, more reflective strand to the story. The rise in animal complexity changes what the Earth remembers. Before the Cambrian, biological activity altered chemistry and left subtle traces. Now the pace and scale of animal life begin to shape sedimentation patterns, continental margins, and biogeochemical cycles in ways that are traceable across eons. The planet's archives shift in content and resolution. Where microbial mats once dominated the stratigraphic script, new laminae bear the marks of burrowing, trampling, and the accumulation of shells. The Earth keeps different kinds of records now, more immediate, plural, and textured. The Cambrian is not an unbroken upward trajectory toward complexity. Extinctions and turnovers follow. Lineages rise and fall. Some bizarre experiments vanish, leaving only hinted echoes in deep time. That mutability is part of the chapter's core lesson. Evolutionary novelty is transient at the level of species, persistent at the level of processes. The mechanisms that produce diversity, variation, selection, ecological coupling remain. The particular bouquets of forms that bloom in the Cambrian are ephemeral, but the evolutionary grammar they exemplify persists. This section closes, as the narrative tradition of this account has done before, with a small, precise image meant to compress the magnitude of change into a human-scaled moment. Picture, then, a shallow shelf under a pale sun. A trilobite skims across the sediment, its compound eyes catching a shimmer. Nearby, a mollusk withdraws into a shell rimmed with silt. A sponge's water current pauses and resumes, filtering a microcosm of particulates. Above them, the surface water hums with planktonic life. A single drop of seawater, flicked by a passing current, lands on a patch of settled silt. In that drop is the chemical memory of the sea-dissolved ions, traces of organic molecules, the residue of millions of interactions. It evaporates, leaving behind a microscopic crust of mineral and organic detritus. This tiny residue, trivial in itself, participates in cycles that will shape shells, feed larvae, and, eventually, be locked into rock. In the Cambrian, the trivial is not trivial. The petty physics of drops, shells, and currents is where profound history is made. The Cambrian explosion is therefore not a spectacle of miracles, but a demonstration of possibility unfolding under the constraints of chemistry, development, and ecological interaction. It is an era when life learned novel ornamentations and strategies, when the seafloor was animated by motion and purpose of a kind that leaves durable marks, and when the planet began to write a different kind of biography. One in which animals, their behaviors, and their bodies would be legible to listeners across billions of years. The tone is not triumphalist, it is contemplative. The Cambrian is both an answer to the question of how life became visible and a reminder that visibility is merely one axis of existence. Complexity rose, left its traces, and then receded and reformed in new ways. The Earth, patient as ever, continued to keep its ledger blank pages waiting for the next set of improbable alignments. What does it mean for a planet to hand the stage to a single realm and then to watch that realm invent its own complexity so thoroughly that the rest of the world must rearrange around it? The question hangs like a tide mark. Here was a planet whose first storytellers were water, and for hundreds of millions of years the ocean read its lines aloud. Then, in a sequence of thresholds and flourishes, the shallow seas became a theatre of abundance, armour, and appetite. An oceanic hegemony that would shape continents and, in time, invite life out of the waves. Life expands. 485-419. Million years ago. The Ordovician and Silurian unfolds as a chapter in which the seas, having been quietly populated for eons, suddenly bore the burden and the brilliance of proliferation. The voice of deep time renders this as less of a sudden proclamation and more of a patient crescendo. Reef systems grow into substantial, three-dimensional architectures, molluscan cousins with gas-filled chambers, orthoconic cephalopods. Thread the water column with long conical lives, jawless fish, once the only vertebrate presence, diversify into myriad forms, each a small experiment in skeletonization and feeding. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of those oceans recalibrating. It is a slow, layered percussion. The click of calcite precipitating on a coral-like colony. The soft rasp of a creeping mollusk on a shelly surface, the periodic snap of a mouth closing on a filamentous prey. Corals in these periods are not the modern stony reefs of tropical seas, but their analogues, tabulate and rugose forms. Construct frameworks of carbonate that begin to anchor a new complexity. These were reef builders that worked in collaboration with stromatoporoids and microbial layers, secreting skeletons that trapped sediment, developing cavities and channels that would become the niches for countless smaller organisms. The narrator lingers on the texture, porous mounds honeycombed with microhabitats, shadows where filter feeders await currents, surfaces pitted with drill holes and repaired scars, evidence of countless encounters. Cephalopods, straight-shelled nautiloids among them, are an unmistakable presence. Their shells, chambered and buoyant, allow a life that oscillates between vertical migration and calculated ambush. They thread light and dark. Their siphons a subtle mastery of physics, regulate gas and fluid, control buoyancy, and move with jet-like surges that unsettle a cloud of microfauna. In the narrator's description, their emergence is not a flourish of intent, but an elaboration of niche, exploitive predators that will reorder community structures by the predation pressure they apply. The vertebrate story at this juncture is dominated by agnathans, jawless fishes, creatures that carry within their poorly mineralized forms the first hints of vertebrate experimentation. Armored plates, rows of teeth like denticles, sucking mouths adapted to cling and graze. These are strategies that speak to a world where feeding is as much about efficiency as it is about invention. In the shallows, large mat-forming communities of microbes and algae provide both food and substrate, and the first vertebrate grazers and filterers navigate this mosaic with an economy of motion honed by selective pressures that have been patient for millions of years. But the Ordovician is not merely an era of accretion, it is also an era of rupture. The narrative turns with a measured chill to the great extinction at the end of the Ordovician. The result, the voice explains, of planetary climate shifts as deep as they are unforgiving. As continents rearrange and as a great ice sheet forms on Gondwana, sea levels fall, shallow shelves drain, and the architecture of life is suddenly exposed and fragmented. Cold, oxygen-poor waters expand, habitats contract. Many of the reef-building architects, the very organisms that had stitched together complexity, are among the hardest hit. The extinction is not portrayed as cosmic malice, but as another threshold moment. The ocean, in becoming the dominant milieu of life, had set itself up to suffer when the physical parameters that supported its shallow, warm shelves were taken away. Silurian recovery is a study in ecological improvisation. When the ice recedes and the seas creep back over shelves, life that remains exploits the vacant niches. Reef building resumes, but now with different compositions and novel partnerships. Importantly, the Silurian marks a subtle but profound turning point. The first green traces of land begin to appear. The narrator frames this not as a triumphant march onto dry ground, but as a cautious experiment, an invasion of consequence. The first plants are tiny and unassuming, moss-like carpets, simple branching filaments, and short, spike-like stalks that lack leaves and true roots. They do not yet form forests. They are pioneers at the margins, peat-forming communities clinging to damp rock and sediment, pockets of green that change the chemistry of the immediate surface. In the telling, these plants are agents of patient engineering. They stabilize sediments, trap moisture, and begin to build rudimentary soils. Crucially, the narrative emphasizes partnerships. Fungi, while invisible in the sedimentary record, are inferred as silent collaborators, their filamentous networks furnishing primitive plants with mineral resources while receiving carbon in return. The narrator calls attention to this mutualism as an essential trick, an ecological workaround that lowers the barriers to terrestrial life. Small arthropods, millipede-like myriapods, and primitive arachnid relatives are among the earliest animal explorers of land. They do not so much conquer the continent as probe it. Their movements are tentative, skittering across damp surfaces, exploiting algal films and locked-in detritus, creating microhabitats in the process. Each scuff and track leaves a trace in the sedimentary memory. Each incision into decaying plant matter produces pulses of decomposition that alter carbon fluxes. In this way, the ocean's dominance begins to precipitate a terrestrial ripple. Life on land will increasingly be an afterimage of marine processes, scaled and reinvented. Then the narrative turns to the Devonian, the age of fish. 419-359 million years ago, an era where oceanic hegemony translates into astonishing diversification. The voice of time is both awed and reflective as it describes how vertebrates, having tinkered in conservative shells for hundreds of millions of years, suddenly diversify into lineages that rework the very grammar of aquatic life. Placoderms, armored, often heavily built fishes, patrol shallow seas and estuaries. Their jaws and bony plates are mechanical inventions that allow more efficient predation and defense. Contemporaneously, two very different strategies of fin and skeleton evolve. Ray-finned fishes, actinopterygians, which will go on to dominate aquatic niches for the foreseeable future, and lobe-finned fishes, sarcopterygians, whose fleshy muscular fins whisper of mobility that, in the right circumstances, might be repurposed. The narrator dwells on the details that matter, because these details are the pivot points for what will follow. Musculoskeletal arrangements that can bear weight, lungs or lung-like sacs that can extract oxygen from air when water becomes hypoxic, and sensory systems that negotiate the ambiguous interface of water and emergent shorelines. Fossil impressions from estuaries and tidal channels show creatures with robust pectoral fins, shoulder girdles that could anchor strong muscles, and gill structures that could function in dual modes. The voice does not anthropomorphize ambition. Instead, it describes a landscape of constraints and opportunities. In some shallow, oxygen-poor lagoons, these anatomical improvisations offer a simple advantage: survive where others cannot. Corals and reef systems flourish anew in the Devonian, but their actors have shifted. Large stromatoporoid sponges become significant architects, building domed reefs teeming with fish, mollusks, and brachiopods. The ocean becomes a vertical world. Pelagic hunters patrol open water, benthic ecologies thicken with burrowers and shell accumulations, and reef corridors channel currents and life into dense hotspots. Cephalopods continue as important midwater predators. Their diversity expands, and their forms experiment with curvature and buoyancy. On land, plants make a transformative leap. Small, simple stalks give way to larger, branching vascular plants, Cooksonia and its kin, capable of conducting water and nutrients internally. By the late Devonian, the first true trees appear. Archaeopteris, a progymnosperm, grows tall, sheds leaves, and creates the first woody tissues resembling modern trunks. The narrator lingers on the silence of that moment, the atmosphere and landscape shifting because of organisms that, by their growth habit, alter erosion, sedimentation, and carbon cycles. Root systems deepen, creating soils that retain moisture and nutrients, allowing even more ambitious plant architectures to stabilize. The voice frames this as a planetary feedback. The rise of land flora remodels weathering rates, increases nutrient runoff into rivers, and thereby changes coastal ecologies, fertilizing estuaries and promoting reef productivity in some places while altering oxygen dynamics in others. The Devonian also witnesses the tentative steps of tetrapodomorphs, fish whose anatomy begins to echo the possibilities of stepping. Fossils that will later be read as transitional broad flat skulls, strengthened limb bones, modified shoulder girdles appear in river deltas and shallow floodplains. The narrator describes one of the era's recurring images, a shallow pool isolated by a retreating tide, its oxygenation dwindling as night cools the water. In such a place, a lobe-finned fish that can gulp air or prop itself with sturdy fins gains a temporary lifeline. These are moments of contingency multiplied. Each struggle to survive in a fickle microhabitat is a trial that, repeated across millions of instances over vast time, yields the anatomical novelties that make terrestrial life thinkable. Yet the Devonian's abundance is not without its own climax of crisis. Reef systems that had expanded dramatically begin to decline in repeated pulses during the Lake Devonian extinction interval. The narrative treats these extinctions with the same sober curiosity it uses for earlier events. No single villain is named. Instead, climate shifts, anoxia in deep waters, sea level changes, and tightened ecological competition conspire to reduce diversity. Large placoderms diminish. Reef architectures collapse in many regions. Lineages that had seemed assured falter. The voice of the story is careful to note the irony. Evolutionary success produces fragility as surely as it creates possibility. The more specialized and abundant an ecosystem becomes, the more it is susceptible to systemic perturbation. Throughout both epochs, the narrator emphasizes the interconnectivity of change. The spread of land plants altered sediment and nutrient fluxes into the sea, which in turn modified the chemistry of shallow shelves and affected reef builders. The evolution of efficient predators changed prey behaviors and selective pressures on shells, spines, and burrowing ecologies. The repeated motif is clear. Morphology, behavior, and environment are locked in feedback loops that, over geological spans, can produce both exuberant diversification and sudden contraction. The emotional register of the voice is contemplative and, at times, quietly awed. The narrator invites the listener to feel the strangeness of a world where most dramatic change was invisible to human scales, where the architecture of ecosystems could be rewritten by microscopic microbial gnats one day and by million-bodied fish migrations the next. The tone resists triumphalism. Instead, it offers a meditation on contingency, that dominion, first the oceans and then, in embryonic ways, the lands, was not inevitable but emergent from an array of accidents, constraints, and opportunities. The chapter closes on an image that compresses the scale of those epochs into a single, human-scaled sensation. A shallow estuary at dusk, where the sky's last light slants across a slick of decaying leaves and algae. A ripple dissipates as a fish part swimmer, part something else, stirs the surface with a heavy fin. A fragment of plant tissue tumbles into the water and becomes food, shelter, and future sediment. In that ripple, the patient work of reefs, cephalopod migrations, plant colonization, and fish experimentation converges. It is a small motion, brief and ordinary, yet in its wake it carries the memory of continents shaded by the first trees and ocean floors scarred by reefs. In that transient contact between water and land, between fin and frond, the planet writes another line of its long biography. The seas had ruled first, and in ruling had already made the conditions for everything that would follow. What does it feel like when the ocean, having ruled unchallenged for 500 million years, begins to hand portions of its world to a different kind of claim? The question is not about triumph or conquest in human terms, but about a series of natural experiments that accumulate until a new ecological grammar is possible. In the late Devonian, that grammar was written in armour and bite force, in lungs hidden inside fins, and in the slow insistence of plants creeping across clay and sand. The chapters that follow, an era that moves from the reign of the great armoured fishes into the dense green architecture of carboniferous swamps, and then toward the drier continental climates of the Permian, are a story of thresholds crossed and habits hardened. In the deep waters of the Devonian, some predators achieved a kind of mechanical perfection. Dunkleosteus, a name that carries the fossil weight of massive placoderms, appears in the record as an archetype of force. It is impossible to describe them without dwelling on the paradox, creatures of rigid, interlocking plates and yet cunning in their hydraulic mechanics. Their jaws were not simple biting surfaces, but shearing machines, bony blades that closed in a fraction of a second and delivered forces that shattered shells and bone. The narrator dwells on the sensory impression this economy of design leaves: ripples of sand collapsing under a sudden rush, a shower of carapace fragments, the hush as a reef community rearranges after a strike. These predators did not think or scheme in a human sense. They were instead efficient consequences of selection, morphological answers to the problem of procuring energy in an abundant but contested seascape. That ecological pressure, the escalating arms race between predator and prey, changed more than immediate survival. It altered sedimentation patterns, favored burrowing strategies, and selected for faster neural circuits and sensory refinement. Eyes became better at detecting movement, appendages became better at grasping, shells and spines became ever more elaborate. The Devonian oceans, rich in reef systems and diverse in benthic architecture, became theatres where bodies were tested for both endurance and novelty. Running parallel to this drama was a quieter, experimental line of evolution, the lobe-finned fishes. These were not the flashiest actors, but in their anatomy lay the possibility for a new relationship with air and land. Inside robust pectoral fins, bones arranged in sequences, humerus, radius, ulna, began to resemble the scaffolding that would one day bear weight outside water. Internal lungs, or lung-like sacs, were present in several lineages. They were physiological redundancies that became useful in oxygen-poor, stagnant pools. The narrator lingers on a recurrent motif. It only takes a change in environment, an ephemeral lagoon isolated by tide or drought, for a marginal structure to become decisive. No single fossil narrative is presented as a character-driven story, but the anatomical hints are evocative. Flattened skulls with dorsally placed eyes speak of fish that mastered bottom dwelling. A neck that allowed the head to move independent of the shoulders emerges as a small revolution, loosening the constraints that had tied the head and body into a single unit. Wrist bones, rudimentary digits, and shoulder girdles capable of anchoring strong muscles appear in certain late Devonian assemblages. These are structural investments that are costly in metabolic terms, yet return the ability to prop and push in very shallow water or onto damp land. It is the accumulation of such small mechanical affordances over countless individuals and generations that creates a new set of ecological possibilities. The Devonian's end is a punctuation of crisis for much of marine life. Reef collapses, episodes of anoxia, and climatic fluctuations cull diversity, yet paradoxically, these crises open spaces that other lineages fill. In the interstices left by retreating reef builders and shrinking lagoons, plants and animals attempt new experiments. The story of life reaching onto land is thus not a single plan unfolding, but an array of opportunistic moves. Plants colonizing wet rocks, arthropods probing the shallow fringe, fish lingering in pools that will dry and either reward or punish the attempt to breathe air. And then the scene shifts into a new chapter 1 of green abundance. The Carboniferous is often described in shorthand as the age of vast coal swamps, and shorthand here is useful because it captures a planetary scale consequence of biological habit. The accumulation of organic matter in anoxic wetlands that, over geologic time, would become seams of coal, the very compressed memory of forests that once exhaled and fell. But the narrator refuses to reduce this epoch to a single product. It is more accurate to see the Carboniferous as a period in which terrestrial life became a constructive force, altering soils, water cycles, and atmosphere in ways that fed back into ecology. The first trees are not romantic oaks, but trunks of lycopsids, Sigillaria and Lepidodendron, giant club moss relatives that rose as columnar towers, their surfaces patterned with scale-like leaf scars. Alongside them grew ferns, horsetails, and primitive seed ferns, a verdant palette arranged in wetland mosaics. The narrator dwells on texture, the sponge-like geometry of peat bogs, the dripping canopies, the slow fall of fronds into black water. Root-like structures, even in early vascular plants, began to bind sediments, creating a substrate where moisture could be retained and where soils, as an emergent property, could form. Fungal networks, often invisible in the rock record, played a crucial, if inferred, role. Mycorrhizal associations that moved phosphorus and other nutrients into plant tissues, enabling greater growth and facilitating the spread inland. These partnerships illustrate a recurrent theme in the story. Access to new environments rarely happens through singular inventions. It happens through collaborations, chemical negotiations, and gradual architectural change. Peat accumulation is a process that invites contemplation because it is both mundane and epoch-defining. Fallen trunks and fronds, submerged and clutching in oxygen-poor water, resist rapid decay. Microbial metabolism in these anoxic layers is slow and, in many cases, carbon is locked away rather than returned to the atmosphere. Over geological time, burial under sediments, heat, and pressure convert these deposits into coal. The narrator describes the process not as a conversion of matter alone, but as a transformation of planetary bookkeeping. Carbon that might have cycled quickly through microbial respiration is now sequestered, altering atmospheric concentrations and, with them, climate. The atmospheric consequence is pronounced. Oxygen concentrations are reconstructed as elevated in the late Carboniferous relative to today estimates suggest values considerably higher, perhaps approaching levels that would make fire behavior and respiration very different. The narrative embraces the consequences with measured awe. Elevated oxygen allowed arthropods to push their anatomical boundaries. Insects and myriapods grew to sizes that would be impossible under our current oxygen partial pressures. Dragonfly-like Meganeura, with wingspans approaching modern birds of prey, patrol flooded fern plains. Arthropleura, a genus of giant millipede-like creatures, drifts along the forest floor, a slow but massive engineer of detritus processing. These are not monstrous fantasies. They are the plausible biophysical consequences of a different atmospheric chemistry interacting with established body plans. Amphibians radiate across this landscape, exploiting the warm, saturated margins of swamps and rivers. Yet amphibians remain tethered to water for reproduction. Eggs and larvae require moisture, and this constraint shapes both behavior and distribution. It is in the contrast between amphibian dependency and the emerging independence of the amniote egg that the next profound threshold appears. The amniotic egg is an innovation in relative freedom, a self-contained ecosystem, a membrane-bound water world that allows vertebrates to reproduce away from standing water. The narrator attends to the quiet genius of this innovation. No metaphor is grander than the fact that a shift in reproductive strategy reworks habitat access. In the Carboniferous, small, shelled eggs and less permeable membranes allowed lineages to colonize drier environments, to escape predators or competition in watery margins, and to exploit resources in upland and seasonally dry landscapes. From these early amniotes, a bifurcation emerges that will echo through the next eras. The split between synapsid lineages, ancestors of mammals, and sauropsid lineages, ancestors of reptiles and, much later, birds. The narrative takes care to emphasize contingency rather than destiny. The anatomical features that mark these groups, skull openings, limb posture, metabolic trajectories, are contingent solutions to ecological problems. They are not prophecies. The environments of the late Carboniferous and early Permian provide testing grounds. Fluctuating climates, shifting habitats, and the new availability of upland niches create selection pressures that favor different anatomical and physiological experiments. The Permian, in turn, is a period of consolidation and stress. As the continents coalesce toward the supercontinent, Pangaea, interior basins become drier, monsoonal patterns intensify the seasonality of precipitation. Forests retract in some regions, swampy coal-forming ecosystems contract. In these shifting landscapes, amniotes that can cope with drought through efficient kidneys, different respiratory strategies, or behavioral adaptations gain advantage. The narrative makes a point of the irony. The success of terrestrial vegetation in the Carboniferous had helped drive oxygen high and sequester carbon, and now the rearrangement of continents and climate presses life to adapt in new ways. There is no moral here, only the slow arithmetic of consequence. Permian ecosystems become increasingly dominated by synapsids in many terrestrial settings. These are not proto-mammals in the romantic sense, but diverse, sometimes bulky creatures that experiment with teeth, differentiation, posture, and metabolic strategies. Reptilian lineages diversify in parallel, invading niches where the synapsids do not dominate. The planet's face is reconfigured repeatedly by the tiny adjustments organisms make to their anatomy, and life history shifts in limb angles that change locomotion efficiency, alterations in dentition that open new diets, and changes in growth strategies that tune survival to seasonality. Throughout this long sweep from Devonian seas to Permian uplands, the narrator keeps returning to the motif of small images that condense immense change. In one such image, simple, tactile, and resonant, the voice describes a single footprint impressed in damp mud along a contracting pool. The track is shallow, edged with ripples and a faint smear where an appendage dragged. For a moment, it is ephemeral. Wind and sun will harden and crack the mud, perhaps burying the track under sediment hours or years later. If preserved, that footprint becomes a fossil, a code translated millions of years hence into anatomical inference. The track is a compressed narrative, a story of limb strength, of substrate, of behavior under constraint. It is also a demonstration of scale, how an act that lasted a single second can, by being preserved, inform the biographies of epochs. Evidence accumulates in many forms. Coal seams that mark the mass balance of ancient carbon, trackways that hint at gait and posture, well-preserved fossils that reveal internal organs in rare cases, and isotopic signatures that suggest atmospheric shifts. The narrator treats these data points as both scaffold and limit the ways in which deep time whispers its secrets in fragments. Where the record is thin, the voice does not invent certainty but invites imagination constrained by mechanism and by what the rocks will permit. There is an emotional contour to this narrative that the narrator does not shy away from. The expansion of life onto land is at once an act of ingenuity and of risk. New habitats offer resources, but also new ways to fail. Desiccation, temperature extremes, and the breakdown of familiar trophic chains. The emotional register that the voice invites is humility. To stand in the presence of these ancient transitions is to feel small before processes indifferent, yet capable of producing conditions that will later host creatures who can tell stories. It is also a quiet awe at the resilience and improvisational power of life, which in countless micro-decisions, tiny mutations, a tweak in metabolism, the fortuitous association with a fungus invented new modes of existence. The chapter closes, as the narrative tradition requires, on a small, precise image that refuses the sweep of geological time and instead compresses it into a moment the listener can hold. Imagine, then, a single fern frond falling into a shallow anoxic pool. It settles, its fibers intact, and the water darkens with dissolved tannins. Above, a dragonfly, a product of elevated oxygen and ecological abundance, beats across the wetland, its shadow briefly crossing the frond. Nearby, a shallow scrape in the mud records the passage of a tetrapod, an experiment in propulsive anatomy. The frond will sink, be buried, become peat, and perhaps enter a seam that future heavier hands will call coal. The dragonfly will molt, die, be eaten, and leave only wings in the sediment. The scrape may become a fossilized trackway. In that composite instant are nested the geological, chemical, and biological processes that carry a planet from an ocean-dominant past to a world where life is no longer merely a surface phenomenon, but an agent of planetary engineering. The conquest of land is thus not conquest in the strict sense, but negotiation. Life learning to persist where water is scarce, to reproduce independently of standing pools, and to reshape the very lithosphere and atmosphere it inhabits. It is an age of experiment, of fleeting giants and enduring microbes, of coal-black forests and drying basins. An era that ends not with a finality, but with a question left open to the next chapter of Earth's long and patient history. What happens when a lineage learns, slowly and by accident, to carry water inside its body while opening itself to the air? What does it mean for life to be trapped between two media long enough that it must invent strategies to survive both, neither fully fish nor fully something else? This is the quiet paradox that frames the next chapter of Earth's long experiment. The age when amphibious lineages, born from fish, fanned out across warm, coal-dark landscapes, when the atmosphere itself swelled with oxygen and allowed insects to dominate the sky at sizes that would seem impossible to a modern eye, and when the draw of dry ground favored new kinds of vertebrates, culminating in a lineage like Dimetrodon, an animal that would stand as a distant structural preface to mammals. The story begins with bodies that remembered the sea. The earliest amphibians were not sudden miracles, but the inevitable tinkering of lineages already predisposed to coping with variable water. Lobe-finned fishes had built, inside their fins, a pattern of bones homologous to the bones of later limbs. The humerus, radius, and ulna, muscles that could push and pull, and lung-like sacs that acted as respiratory backups in oxygen-poor shallow water. In certain ponds and floodplain channels where tides and drought made water ephemeral, those small anatomical redundancies acquired new meanings. A fin that could press against soft substrate became a prop for crawling, an air-breathing sac became a lifeline. When water thinned, skin that could absorb oxygen helped in half-submerged lives. Over millions of generations, the shape of necessity hardened into habit. Limbs replaced paddles for moments, feet emerged as instruments of negotiation between rock and mud. A life cycle still tied to water eggs and larvae remained the string that bound them. These proto-amphibians carried the compromises of that history. Their skins had to be moist to facilitate cutaneous respiration. Their eggs required watery nurseries. They could not abandon water entirely. Yet within these compromises lay opportunities. New food sources in shallow margins, fewer competitors on land, new ways to hide and ambush. The planet, in the Carboniferous, provided both the resources and the shelter for these experiments. This was an epoch of wetlands made vast by plant ambition. The Earth's lowlands were bound into an almost continuous carpet of swamps and peat-forming forests. Ladders of lycopsids, tree-like club mosses, horsetails and ferns that sequestered carbon and trapped it in waterlogged bogs. The consequence was geological and atmospheric in equal measure. Carbon buried in sediments lowered atmospheric CO2 and, by several lines of proxy evidence, allowed oxygen to rise to levels well above those of today. Stomatile indices from fossilized leaves, charcoal records, and the extraordinary thickness of coal seams all point to a world with a significantly higher oxygen partial pressure. Under such conditions, the chemistry of breath and the physics of diffusion changed in small but consequential ways. That increase in oxygen had an unexpected architectural effect on life's air-breathing designs. Insects breathe through tracheal systems, networks of tubes that deliver oxygen directly to tissues. At modern oxygen concentrations, those systems and body shapes impose strict limits on size because diffusion alone can only carry oxygen effectively across short distances. With a richer atmosphere, oxygen could reach deeper tissues and meet higher metabolic demands in larger bodies. The result, once plants had built the scaffolding of peat and the air swelled, was gigantism. Meganeura, often described as a dragonfly, the size of a crow, patrolled the Carboniferous skies with wingspans approaching 70 centimeters. Arthropleura, a millipede-like arthropod, crawled like a slow armored ridge along forest floors, its body segments stretching to lengths that modern analogues cannot match. These were not freaks, they were direct, physical responses to an environment where oxygen permitted larger sizes and where vast expanses of vegetative abundance provided the caloric economy to sustain them. The presence of such giants rewrote the ecological grammar of the swamps. Flight at that scale reorganized predation and avoidance. A large aerial predator could carry diverse energies across flooded plains and press hunting pressure on small vertebrates at the water's edge. On land, massive detritivores turned leaves into nutrient flows, each step grinding detritus into the microbial soups that fed smaller creatures. The carbon economy of the planet, its capture, burial, and release was not merely a backdrop. It was an actor that shaped body plans, yet the Carboniferous's lushness contained its own fragility. The very processes that elevated oxygen also made landscapes vulnerable to climatic shifts. When regional tectonics and the slow migration of continents altered rainfall patterns, when cooling pulses and changes in sea level rearranged shallow margins, the swamps receded. The habitats that favored giant arthropods and amphibians shrank. This was not an abrupt collapse in all places at once, but a spatial mosaic of stress. Some basins dried, others persisted as refugia, and the balance of ecological opportunity shifted toward lineages that could escape the watery dependency. That shift favored a suite of innovations that were small in anatomy but enormous in consequence. The evolution of the amniote egg, an enclosure of membranes and shells that protected embryonic life from desiccation, freed certain vertebrates from the necessity of returning to water to reproduce. An amniote could lay a shelled, self-contained egg in a nest on dry land. Its young emerged ready to negotiate terrestrial microhabitats. This reproductive move opened uplands, seasonal plains, and interior basins to lineages that would otherwise be constrained. With it came a physiological and ecological cascade. Less dependence on standing water for reproduction led to greater opportunities for exploitation of drier niches, and to different selective pressures on locomotion, thermoregulation, and water balance. In the new, drier theatres of the Permian, continental interiors warmed and cooled with more extreme swings. The assembly of Pangaea tightened climate belts, monsoons intensified where coastlines remained, and extended droughts claimed previous wetlands. Vegetation shifted from peat-forming coal swamps to plants adapted to fluctuating moisture regimes, including seeds, compact packages of embryonic life that could endure dry spells. These botanical changes altered the supply lines of nutrients to rivers and coasts, diminished the global burial rate of carbon, and nudged atmospheric composition back toward different equilibria. It is in these transformed landscapes that a distinct lineage of terrestrial vertebrates rose to prominence, the synapsids. Among them, Dimetrodon stands as a clear and memorable form. It is easy to misread Dimetrodon as some kind of dinosaur from a later chapter, but it is instead a representative of a branch of amniotes more closely allied with the ancestors of mammals. Its silhouette quadrupedal, sprawling in stance with a high dorsal sail, captures a series of functional speculations that paleobiologists continue to debate. The sail, formed by extended neural spines, may have been a thermoregulatory surface, an apparatus to harvest morning warmth or to cool by convective flow as the animal raced across open ground. Perhaps it was a display structure, signaling individual quality or size in a landscape where visual cues matter across distances of parched, open terrain. Or it may have had multiple uses, its significance changing with seasons and contexts. Regardless of its exact function, the sail is a vivid example of how an organism's anatomy can be both an immediate response to environmental pressures and a stage for subsequent evolutionary play. Dimetrodon and its kin were predators that rewired terrestrial food webs. Their differentiated teeth incisors for slicing, robust caniniforms for gripping, reflect dietary specializations that demand higher energetic budgets and more active predation. The synapsid skull architecture, with a single temporal fenestra behind the orbit, allowed the attachment of larger jaw muscles, granting bite power the older body plans lacked. These are structural innovations that did not imply foresight. They were incremental alignments of form with function, selected in landscapes where mobility and force determined success or failure. The Permian's transition from coal-rich swamps to more arid basins did more than rearrange ecosystems. It rerouted evolutionary trajectories. Organisms that could conserve water, that could regulate body temperature with behavioral and perhaps vascular tricks, and that could reproduce away from open water, acquired long-term advantages in the interior basins. Such pressures favored synapsids in many places and offered niche spaces for sauropsids, ancestral reptiles, to diversify in others. Evolution became a conversation of trade-offs. Traits that offered success under one climate regime became liabilities under another. The planet's shifting climate rewrote the rules of the game repeatedly. What binds these transformations together is a recurring motif. Small physical changes, accumulated over many generations and multiplied across enormous populations, can redirect the narrative of life. A slightly more efficient lung, a tweak in limb bone articulation, a membrane that keeps an egg's interior moist, none are dramatic on their own. Yet, in the aggregate, they change the set of ecological possibilities the world can host. Evidence for this epoch's story comes in fragments embedded in stone, trackways across dried mudflats that speak to gait and posture, fossilized skeletons preserving jaw complexity, and sail spines, coal seams that measure the mass balance of ancient carbon, chemical proxies, ratios of carbon isotopes, the abundance and distribution of charcoal, speak to atmospheric composition and to the prevalence of wildfire. Paleobotanical data reconstruct the vegetation assemblages that built the peat layers. Together, these lines are not a single, neat proof, but a constellation of clues that, when interpreted with care, reveal the contours of a changing planet. The emotional pitch of the account is both modest and exacting. There is wonder in the image of a dragonfly the size of a modern hawk, in the fluted ridge of an arthropod, the length of a man, in the turned-back jaw of a dimetrodon silhouetted against an ochre sky. There is also a quiet humility. These spectacles were not triumphs of design, but of contingent physics, chemistry, and history. The same atmospheric and tectonic calculations that allowed giants and sprawling swamps could, with different timings or magnitudes, have yielded a very different world. The closing image is deliberately small and tactile, meant to compress epochs into an instant that can be held in the mind. Picture a shallow, shrinking pond ringed with glossy ferns. An early amphibian lifts one webbed foot and presses down on soft mud, leaving a footprint. A clear, rounded impression, dark with organic detritus. A moment later, a sheet of sunlight catches the wing of a passing meganeura as it folds itself upon a frond. The wing briefly refracts the light like a membrane of glass. Farther off, the low ridge of Dimetrodon's sail casts a long, thin shadow across cracked clay as the animal thermoregulates near a river. In that convergence of impressions, footprint, wing-glint, sail shadow, are the measures of a planet in motion, organisms adapting to the atmosphere they helped shape, bodies responding to the physics of air and mud, life inventing strategies to persist as habitats shrink, expand, and reorganize. The scene is ordinary, ephemeral, and yet consequential. The prints will be buried, the wings will fossilize only rarely, the sail's shadow will be lost to time. But the alterations they represent, the shift from fin to foot, the flowering of arthropod gigantism, the rise of amniote strategies, are the small mechanical edits by which Earth's long story continued to be written. What does it take to unmake almost everything and, in the same slow breath, open a new page of possibility? That question hangs at the center of the end. Permian world, like a grey column of smoke rising from a vast, burning horizon. It is the image this section opens on, a sky thick with ash and choking gases, seas that taste of metal and rot, forests turned to charcoal, an almost unimaginable attrition that, geologically speaking, becomes the baseline from which the Mesozoic story begins. The Great Dying was not a single thunderclap, but a concatenation of thresholds, geophysical, chemical, and ecological, crossed in a relatively short span of geological time. When listeners hear 90% of species vanished, the mind often reaches for a cinematic scene, a single catastrophe with neat before and after frames. The truth was messier and, in ways that matter for the later story of life, stranger. Multiple stresses piled atop one another, each amplifying the effects of the next, so that ecosystems that had persisted for tens of millions of years simply unraveled. The narrative voice does not anthropomorphize this process. It observes the arithmetic of cause and effect and lets the raw mechanics speak for the drama. At the physical center of the event lay the Siberian Traps, an enormous episode of flood basalt volcanism. Over perhaps hundreds of thousands to a few million years, enormous volumes of lava poured out across what is today northern Asia. But it is the chemical accompaniment to that lava that matters as much as the rock itself. The emplacement of such vast basaltic provinces is rarely a purely local phenomenon. As magma intruded into volatile rich sediments, coal, carbonates, and organic rich layers, it baked, thermally altered, and released sequestered carbon and sulfur. Gigatons of carbon dioxide and methane were liberated on top of already high background greenhouse levels. Sulfur aerosols intermittently dimmed sunlight, but the cumulative effect of greenhouse gases was relentless warming. When warming reaches a planetary scale, it does not merely change temperature, it rewrites the physics of oceans and atmosphere. Oceans, which had been the biosphere's principal archive of life, registered these changes quickly. As surface waters warmed, their ability to hold oxygen declined, stratification increased, so the deeper waters ceased to mix with the oxygenated surface. The result was widespread oceanic anoxia. Vast swaths of the seafloor suffocated. Where anoxia met high concentrations of reduced compounds, hydrogen sulfide formed and, at times, may have bubbled from shallow seas into the air, poisoning coastal ecosystems and even continental margins. For organisms that relied on oxygen-rich waters or stable redox gradients, reef builders, many benthic invertebrates, numerous fish lineages, the change was fatal. At the same time, acidification chewed away at the chemistry that supports calcification. Many marine organisms build shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate. When seawater chemistry shifts toward more acidic conditions, the energetic cost of building and maintaining such structures skyrockets. The fossil record of the end, Permian, shows the collapse of reefs. Complex calcium carbonate architectures that had stood for long stretches were reduced to patchy, short-lived microbial buildups. The primary engineers of carbonate platforms, sponges, brachiopods, shelled algae, either declined drastically or disappeared in many regions. Food webs thinned. Energy pathways, once fast and robust, became leaky and inefficient. On land, the effects were no less profound. Massive volcanic outgassing and the cascade of climate feedbacks provoked abrupt shifts in vegetation patterns. Forests that once carpeted lowlands and river valleys, plants whose long-term burial had been part of Earth's carbon accounting, were subjected to thermal stress, drought, and the spread of fire. Charcoal deposits increase in some stratigraphic sections, a geological signature of widespread burning. Soil profiles show erosional pulses as vegetative cover retreated and storms scoured unanchored landscapes. A strange ecological fingerprint appears in the aftermath, a fungal spike in certain sediments, which some researchers interpret as the proliferation of fungi that consume dead plant matter at a rate outpacing other decomposers. It is a small-scale image with planetary implications. Detrital systems overwhelmed, nutrient cycles broken, the usual recycling of biomass temporarily derailed. And yet the extinction was not uniform. It was, instead, highly selective. Certain lineages, particularly those able to tolerate wide environmental ranges or to exploit low oxygen or brackish niches, persisted and even thrived in the immediate aftermath. The fossil record of the earliest Triassic is a portrait of ecological simplification and opportunism. Low diversity faunas dominated by a few so-called disaster taxa, broad, geographically widespread species that tolerated poor conditions. On land, dicynodonts like Lystrosaurus, a squat, herbivorous synapsid, become locally ubiquitous across Pangaea. Their proliferation is a signal of how terrestrial ecosystems restructured around generalist survivors. Marine environments, once filled with complex trophic architectures, were for a time dominated by microbial mats and opportunistic benthos, simpler, low-energy communities that would persist until the slow, staggered recovery of more complex systems. Recovery from the Great Dying unfolded slowly and unevenly. In many places it took millions of years for biodiversity to rebuild to pre-extinction levels, and certain functional groups, reef-building calcifiers for example, were absent or stunted for tens of millions of years. But extinction is not merely subtraction, it is also the opening of ecological space. The vacated niches form blank canvases upon which evolution, under different constraints and with a different cast of surviving lineages, can experiment. The end. Permian collapse erased many old winners and, in doing so, relaxed the ecological competitive pressures that had previously constrained other groups. Where once synapsids and their kin had dominated many continental niches, new archosauriform lineages, groups with different body plans and metabolic tendencies, found opportunities to expand. Thus, the stage that the Great Dying cleared was accidental and directional in equal measure. The Mesozoic did not arrive as a consequence of intention. It was a statistical outcome of who happened to survive and of the altered environmental grammar that shaped subsequent selection. When the Triassic dawned, Earth's climate was still volatile, but new experiments in body plan, physiology, and ecological organization began to proliferate. Coastal shelves reflooded, rift basins opened as Pangaea's sutures loosened, and marine corridors formed that would be corridors of dispersal and speciation. These new geographies, long, shallow seaways, and an abundance of small, isolated basins, offered heterogeneous habitats that favored diversification. The age of dinosaurs begins here, not because of a single arboreal or terrestrial innovation, but because of a concatenation of opportunity and survival. Biased starting conditions. In the Triassic, archosaurs, relatives and cousins to crocodilian lions and to the clade that would give rise to true dinosaurs, diversified into a variety of forms: bipedal cursorial predators, armored herbivores, and long-necked forms exploring new foraging strategies. The narrative of their rise is neither teleological nor simple. Different clades explored morphological space in parallel, competing, and diverging according to local selection regimes. In many parts of Pangaea, synapsid diversity waned while archosauriform diversity expanded. The ecological balance shifted as environments warmed, sea levels varied, and vegetation patterns changed. Climate through the Mesozoic was generally warmer than today, with higher atmospheric CO2 and little to no polar ice. That greenhouse world reshaped the physics of weather, the distribution of biomes, and the chemistry of oceans. Sea levels were often higher, creating extensive shallow continental shelves, prime real estate for marine productivity and for the evolution of giant marine reptiles. Ichthyosaurs that sliced through open waters with sleek bodies convergent with modern dolphins, long-necked plesiosaurs that probed pelagic columns for fish, and mosasaurs that later, in the Cretaceous, became the apex swimmers. These were not dinosaurs, but their dominance of the seas reflected the same logic of opportunity following the deep reconfiguration of ecosystems. On land, the Mesozoic flora set the ecological stage. For much of the era, gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, and ginkgophytes dominated landscapes, creating open woodlands and fern understory mosaics. These plant architectures supported a wide spectrum of herbivores, from the small, beaked ornithischians nibbling on low vegetation to the colossal sauropods that reached high into canopies, cropping foliage inaccessible to others. The rise of angiosperms, the flowering plants, would not dominate until the Cretaceous, but when they did, they rewired plant-animal interactions. Initially, however, gymnosperm-heavy ecosystems structured the food webs that the earliest dinosaurs and their contemporaries inhabited. The diversity of Mesozoic dinosaurs is, to modern ears, the most mesmerizing fact of the era. Sauropods, long-necked, barrel-bodied herbivores, became some of the largest land animals ever to walk the planet, a mechanical response to the economics of feeding in a world of voluminous but relatively low-nutrient plant matter. Theropods, bipedal predators, range from diminutive, swift forms to formidable apex hunters, and it is within small, feathered theropods that the origin of avian flight marks another evolutionary experiment. Ornithischians diversified into armored, tusked, and beaked lineages, each solving herbivory with different morphological trades. The Mesozoic is not a story of linear progress toward bigger or faster. It is a tableau of niche partitioning and repeated solutions to common ecological problems. Behavioral and physiological innovations also matter. An erect posture in many dinosaur lineages, repositioned limbs beneath the body, improving locomotion efficiency and enabling sustained terrestrial activity. Respiratory adaptations, perhaps akin to the air sac systems in birds, may have augmented oxygen uptake and metabolic rate in certain clades, allowing higher activity levels. Social behaviors, herding, nesting, parental care emerge in the fossil record as repeatable strategies, not as moral choices, but as selected responses to environmental pressures like predation and resource distribution. Again, the voice of deep time stresses contingency, an anatomical tweak that improves feeding efficiency or reproductive output in one environment can cascade into dramatic demographic and macroevolutionary patterns across millions of years. The Mesozoic world is textured in colors and sounds that the narrator can only gesture toward. The metallic scrape of a mandibular tooth on tough conifer needles, the distant trumpeting rumble of a sauropod moving across a floodplain, the whisper of wings as pterosaurs rode thermal columns above coastal lagoons. Marine shelves teem with ammonites, coiled mollusks whose rapid speciation makes them excellent timekeepers for geologists, while coral-like rudist bivalves dominate certain reef-like assemblages in the Cretaceous. The planet, having reorganized after the Permian crisis, re-established complex trophic pyramids and geographic mosaics that would persist for some 190 million years. Yet the Mesozoic, like every other chapter, is bounded by contingency. The rise of dinosaurs and their contemporaries was not inevitable. It was contingent upon which lineages survived the Great Dying, on the particular climatic envelope of the Triassic and Jurassic, and on the geometric reconfiguration of continents that produced diverse coastal and interior habitats. The age of dinosaurs is thus both a story of spectacular diversification and of deep historical luck. This section, faithful to the pattern of earlier chapters, ends not on a continent-wide tableau, but on a small, precise image meant to hold the entire sweep in a single human-scaled moment. Imagine a damp shore at the margin of an inland sea, a place where the Mesozoic world meets the weather. At the water's edge, a single footprint is impressed in soft mud, 3 forward-facing claws splayed, the central pad pressed deeper than the toes. The print captures weight, gait, and anatomy in a single negative. For a few brief seconds, it is merely a deformation of substrate. By chance, and by the slow action of burial and lithification, it is preserved. Millions of years later, that fossil will speak to anatomy and behavior, but in its first instant, the print meant something simpler. A life negotiating the interface of water and land, balance and motion, heat and food. It is an ordinary mark, ephemeral and accidental. And yet it is the sort of small, repeatable event that, compounded across species and eons, writes the lexicon of planetary biography. The Great Dying made room for such marks to multiply. The age of dinosaurs filled that space with forms both strange and staggering. The planet's long story continued, written as always in the interplay of contingency, constraint, and the slow, patient arithmetic of evolution. What if the story of giant life on Earth is not a single upward arc, but a relay of experiments, each chapter carrying the world a little farther from the chemistry of its beginnings and a little closer to forms that would, for a while, dominate the planet's visible drama? The Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous compose such a relay, 3 long experiments in anatomy, locomotion, ecology, and climate, each one layering new possibilities atop the residues of the last. From the ashes of the Permian collapse, life did not so much resume as reinvent the rules of scale. The Triassic opens as a provisional world. Pangaea is still a single, swollen continent, a geometry that imposes long continental interiors, broad arid belts, narrow coastal margins, and rapidly shifting monsoons. Geology and climate conspire to make the Triassic a patchwork of extremes, scorched basins, ephemeral lakes, and lush coastal corridors where life could gather. It is in these marginal realms that the first dinosaurs appear, not as the rulers they would become in some later imagination, but as small, lithe experiments in bipedal balance and sustained predation or quick escape. The early dinosaurs are physiologies inked in economy. Their limbs become long and gracile, their pelvises reorganize to shift weight over hind legs, tails act as counterbalances. These are not heroic acts, they are incremental solutions to locomotor trade-offs. In the sun-baked lowlands, where vegetation tends toward low shrubs and cycads, being able to run or sidestep quickly can be the difference between starvation and survival. The fossil record, in its fragmentary way, preserves those experiments: ankle bones that permit a springing gait, teeth shaped for slicing or shearing, vertebrae lightened and strengthened for long-distance support. Across the Triassic plains and wetlands, archosaurs diversify broadly. Some lineages take to the water, others to the air, and within a few million years a faint but persistent pattern emerges. Dinosaurs are experimenting with being consistently upright, efficient, and, ultimately, adaptable. That adaptability matters because the Triassic world is itself unstable. Tectonics push and pull, climates oscillate, the ecological vacuum left by the Permian die-off invites opportunists. The Triassic is not simply a prelude, it is a laboratory of new body plans and life habits. Small, warm-blooded synapsid cousins survive in the underbrush, amphibious lineages linger at margins, and the first true dinosaurs move quietly into the niches left open by their vanished competitors. It is a scene of patient tinkering rather than melodrama. Tiny shifts in limb articulation, modest alterations in tooth shape, and subtle reorganizations of reproductive strategy accumulate. From the long view of time, those low-level edits turn the rulebook. When the Jurassic dawns, the planet looks different. Pangaea's seams have begun to pull, shallow seaways spread between continental fragments. Climate warms and becomes more equable in many latitudes. Rainforests swell in some corridors, while vast floodplains stretch across others. Into this more fragmented and wetter world, a new kind of Mesozoic megascape arises. Gigantic sauropods, the long-necked titans of the Jurassic, become perhaps the most striking illustration of what happens when ecology scales up. Their bodies are engineering problems writ in bone columns of limb bones like architectural piers, lightened vertebrae with internal chambers, necks extended into long leverage systems. To be a sauropod is to be an economy of throughput. Huge volumes of plant matter must be processed each day. Digestive systems must extract usable calories from low-nutrient foliage, and reproduction must be prolific enough to sustain populations against predation and juvenile mortality. Sauropod size is not mere spectacle. In the Jurassic, their enormous bulk reshapes habitats. Grove after grove of conifers and cycads bear the repeated browsing of these animals. Fallen branches and compacted soil produce microenvironments for ferns and understory plants. Theirs is a world of slow ecological engineering. The trampling and the dung of countless individuals alter nutrient pathways, redistribute seeds and pollen, and in aggregate create corridors of changed vegetation. The fossil record records their presence as more than bones, trackways stretching like hieroglyphs across ancient mudflats, coprolites rich in ground plant material, and the spatial patterning of vegetation preserved in sedimentary textures. Above these giants, the sky acquires its own rulers. Pterosaurs evolve into a diverse caste, some small and insectivorous, others with wingspans that challenge the imagination. Their wings are membranes stretched across elongated digits, intimate experiments in lifting thin, membranous anatomy into sustained flight. The ocean too is not idle. Ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs carve through pelagic columns with convergent body plans for speed and hunting. The Jurassic seas, like the terrestrial plains, are stratified theatres of form. Midwater predators driving prey shoals, long-necked plesiosaurs probing shoals and reefs, and ammonites exploding into varied shell architectures that become temporal markers for geologists. A subtle but consequential innovation occurs among smaller theropods. Feathers begin to appear, not as flight apparatuses at first, but as insulation, display, and perhaps rudimentary gliding surfaces. The Solnhofen limestones of the late Jurassic capture one of these transitions in exceptional detail. A delicate feathered outline around a small, avian-like body that steps between the non-avian theropods and what will become the first true birds. Feathers, in this sense, are a lesson in exaptation. Structures evolve for one function and are later co-opted for another, reiterating that natural history is a palimpsest of uses. The Cretaceous expands these experiments into an even more complex mosaic. Continental fragmentation continues, climates remain generally warm that produce regional differences that foster endemism. Critical to the Cretaceous narrative is the angiosperm revolution. Flowering plants appear, diversify, and begin to rewire terrestrial ecosystems in ways both subtle and profound. They produce new kinds of leaves, novel reproductive strategies, and, most importantly, pollen and nectar that invite the rise of specialized pollinators. Insects respond, diversify, and form intimate ecological partnerships with plants, a feedback loop that reshapes food webs. Vegetation changes ripple upward. Hadrosaurs, the so-called duck-billed dinosaurs, evolved grinding dental batteries that can process tough, fibrous material, enabling herds to exploit a variety of plant resources. Ceratopsians, with their beaks and ornate frills, diversify into forms that reshape how low browsing is performed. In the north, the great horned Triceratops becomes a visible emblem of this age. A heavy-bodied, quadrupedal grazer with powerful beaks and a frill that may have served multiple purposes. Defense against predators, signaling within species, or thermoregulation. In the oceans, mosasaurs become apex swimmers. On land, tyrannosaurs rise to prominence in the late Cretaceous as apex predators with jaws engineered for bone-crushing force. Tyrannosaurus rex is a study in anatomical extremity. Robust skull bones, massive jaw reductors, teeth shaped as cross-sectionally thick blades. It is the outcome of a long arc of selection favoring bite force and shock resistance. Yet its dominance is ecological, not teleological. It occupies a niche carved by food, availability, competition, and the spatial arrangement of habitats. Its presence changes the dynamics of herbivore populations and likely shapes herd behavior and defensive morphologies among plant eaters. Cretaceous ecosystems are also experiments in sensory and reproductive innovation. Parental care, nesting behaviors, and perhaps social herding patterns can be inferred from fossil nesting grounds and bone bed assemblages. Small feathered theropods further diversify, some develop flight-capable wings, and the deep branches between non-avian dinosaurs and birds continue to be explored in the fossil record. The interplay of feathers, thermoregulation, and display continues to be a recurring theme. Structures initially useful for missive signaling or insulation become instruments of aeriality. Across the Cretaceous, the planet's climate, flora and fauna move in complex feedbacks. The spread of angiosperms, introduces new nutrient cycles. Flowers and fruits change the nature of food availability, seeds change dispersal dynamics, and pollinator plant coevolution creates micro-ecological niches. Where once gymnosperm-dominated plant communities structured the food supply, now many ecosystems are being restructured into a patchwork where flowers, insects, and vertebrates form tight ecological couplings. And yet even at the Cretaceous' luscious zenith, there are hints of fragility. Geological records record increased volcanic episodes in some regions. Oceanic anoxic events punctuate warmer intervals. The planet's history is never a smooth upward slope. Rather, it is a sine wave opportunity and stress. Large body size, highly specialized feeding apparatuses and codependencies can create remarkable biological success in the short run, but create vulnerability when climates shift, when food webs become leaky, or when global perturbations occur. It is precisely the sense of impending contingency that gives the closing scenes of the Cretaceous their poignancy. The world, peopled by giants and lined with new plant architectures, carries the accumulated legacy of three experiments: initial dinosaurian strategies forged in the Triassic, gigantism and aerial dominance cemented in the Jurassic, and ecological reweaving through angiosperm-vertebrate coevolution in the Cretaceous. The archives, the sediments, the pollen, the isotopic signatures tell of an ecosystem rich in complexity and specialization. Fossils record not only the forms, but the chemistry of the air and sea. Carbon isotopes suggest shifts in productivity. Oxygen proxies hint at regional fluctuations. Trace elements mark volcanic episodes. These are the technical footnotes that constrain and enable the grander narrative. If the Mesozoic is a long, layered experiment in scale and interaction, then its last pages are written with an uneasy clarity. The planet has constructed a complex edifice of life that is at once resilient and precarious. A single, swift change in the planetary boundary conditions, energetics, sunlight, atmospheric chemistry, could cascade in ways that the most elaborate anatomical innovations cannot withstand. It is here, in the hush that follows the catalogue of species and forms, that the narrative pauses. The closing image is intentionally small and intimate. A single pollen grain, encased in a fragile membrane, lifts from the stomatal surface of a Cretaceous flower and drifts into a warm breeze. It tumbles, encounters the sticky surface of an insect's leg, and is ferried across a shallow valley into a different floral community. That minute shuttle of biology. One grain, one insect, one fertilization event epitomizes the Cretaceous web. It is both ordinary and exquisite. It is a private exchange that, multiplied trillions of times each season, sustains forests and herds, predators and parasites, nests and migrations. And yet the listener is left with a single, persistent question. What happens when that ordinary exchange is interrupted across the globe? The planet, patient and indifferent, keeps its ledger. The secular arithmetic of biology and geology has, before, been forced to rebalance. After 3 acts of innovation and expansion, in Triassic smallness, in Jurassic gigantism, in Cretaceous reweaving, the stage is set for a final and cataclysmic punctuation. The record offers signs, anomalous layers in sediments, rare isotopic excursions, sudden changes in microfossil assemblages, that something more is coming. The world's balance of light, nutrient, and atmosphere can be tipped. The story thus pauses at the edge of a turning. The fall that will follow is not inevitable in any teleological sense, but it is made possible by the very success of the Mesozoic experiments. The floor is crowded with the residues of long histories: bones, dung, nests, pollen, shells. each of them evidence that life had, for a long time, found ways to convert sunlight and minerals into astonishing forms. The next chapter will ask what happens when the physical world conspires, in a sudden and vast movement, to erase those forms from the visible stage, and, in the erasure, to open new rooms of possibility. For now, the deep time voice leaves the listener with the image of that pollen grain, so small, so ordinary, so vulnerable, and with an insistence. Greatness in nature often rests upon fragility, and sometimes the smallest tokens carry the memory of entire worlds. What happens when a single, momentary violence rewrites the grammar of an entire world? What does the planet remember, and what does it forget when a curtain falls on the Mesozoic stage? The question is the hinge of this chapter, the abrupt ending of one long experiment, dominance by dinosaurs and their contemporaries, and the slow, patient opening of many others, chief among them the story of mammals. The record is stubbornly precise in some respects. Around 66 million years ago, a mass of rock and metal, tens of kilometers across, struck the shallow marine margin of what would become the Yucatan Peninsula. The impact was not merely local, it was a global punctuation. The imperceptible arithmetic of inertia and velocity converted into a physical episode of enormous brutality. An immediate blast, regional earthquakes, and tsunamis that raced outward across ocean basins. At the point of contact, rock vaporized into a flame so hot that surface vegetation could ignite at great distances. The sky momentarily filled with incandescent ejecta, molten droplets and incandescent dust that fell like a second, lethal rain. But the immediate flash was only the first act. For months and years afterward, the atmosphere itself was altered. Fine dust and soot lofted into the stratosphere, scattering and absorbing sunlight, shutting down photosynthesis across latitudes. Global temperatures plummeted as sunlight failed to reach the surface. The world entered a kind of volcanic winter. Simultaneously, chemical byproducts, acidic vapors, and nitrous compounds rained out, stressing aquatic and terrestrial chemistries. Oceans, already marginal in many places, suffered shocks, surface cooling followed by regional warming, changes in circulation, and perturbations to oxygenation. The geological fingerprints, iridium anomalies in sediments worldwide, shocked quartz grains, and a layer of spherules spun from molten rock are the planet's shorthand for the catastrophe. They speak in matter, not metaphor. The ecological consequences were swift and severe. Food chains fractured at the base. Phytoplankton and shallow. Water algae, stripped of direct sunlight, crashed in abundance. Primary productivity faltered. Creatures at higher trophic levels, specialized herbivores, and the predators that depended upon them, found their niches evaporating. On land, large-bodied animals that required extensive home ranges, steady food supplies, and long reproductive cycles were especially vulnerable. Across both sea and land, many groups simply did not recover from the rapid, global reshuffling of energy flows. Into this vacuum, the fossil record writes a brutal hypothesis. Non-avian dinosaurs vanish as a dominant terrestrial force. Reef communities unravel. Many marine reptiles and ammonites fade. Yet extinction was not universal. Certain lineages persisted. Birds' ancestors, small crocodilian and turtle lineages, various invertebrates, and pockets of microorganisms. Above all, small mammals, already present but marginal through the Mesozoic, endured. Why some lineages survived while others perished is a question of contingency and physiology. Small body size, generalist diets, nocturnal or burrowing habits, and reproductive strategies that could be sustained in fragmented, resource-poor landscapes proved advantageous. The immediate image that compresses the event is paradoxically intimate. A blanket of ash and soot dims at dusk, and beneath a scorched forest canopy, a small, nocturnal creature emerges from a burrow. The world outside is colder and quieter. The air tastes of smoke and metallic salt. Food is scarce, and danger lurks in unpredictable forms. That tiny survivor is not a protagonist in a human drama, but an instance of biology's statistical persistence. Innumerable trials, repeated over millennia, yield a handful of survivors who will inherit an emptied stage. The long aftermath is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It is patient, multitudinous, and full of tiny adjustments. For the first several 100,000 to a few million years, ecosystems are in low diversity states dominated by opportunistic disaster taxa. Southward and poleward migrations show up in oxygen and carbon isotope signatures. Dead zones in the ocean expand and retract. A slow recovery of primary productivity begins as light returns and nutrient regimes reset. Mammals, freed from the towering shadow of giant dinosaurs, slowly widen their ecological experiments. The Paleocene is a period of recovery and diversification. The earliest post-impact mammals are still small, mouse to rat-sized in most reconstructions, but they occupy an ever wider range of diets and habits. Dental specializations proliferate, bonodont molars for crushing, shearing crests for cutting, ever more complex arrangements that allow exploitation of insects, seeds, and the soft tissues of plants. Endothermy, already in place in many mammalian lineages, permits activity in cooler nights and expands temporal niches. Lactation and extended parental care allow for different life history strategies, facilitating survival even when resources are patchy. Over tens of millions of years, these features coalesce into what paleontologists read as adaptive radiation, a burst, not of size but of ecological roles. The Eocene, arriving amid general greenhouse warmth, amplifies the possibilities. Warm, equable climates extend tropical forests poleward. Forested landscapes dominate many continents, and mammals diversify in those arboreal and forest floor settings. Early primates appear, adapted to grasping limbs and forward-facing eyes, sensory and locomotor suites allied to life in a three-dimensional leafy world. Early ungulates, small, nimble herbivores with high-crowned teeth in some lines, explore browsing niches. The ancestors of cetaceans experiment with semi-aquatic life. Gradually, over many lineages and millions of years, the lineage that will become whales returns to the sea, trading weight-bearing limbs for flippers, skull modifications for sonar sensitivity, and blowholes adapted to air breathing while submerged. The Eocene is, in its own right, a study in exaptation. Features that evolved in one context are co-opted for new functions in another. But the planet is not static. Tectonics shift oceanic gateways, Antarctic glaciation begins in the Oligocene, and global climate cools and dries. These broad-scale trends tighten selective pressures. Forests retract in many regions, and open habitats expand. Grasses, initially minor components under the canopy, begin to diversify and spread in the Miocene. Grasslands are not simply new vegetation types, they are entirely different mechanical and nutritional environments. Their abrasive silicates favor teeth with higher crowns. Their seasonal productivity favors grazers with digestive specializations. Their open vistas change predator-prey dynamics. The Neogene sees mammals respond with evolutionary experimentation on large scales. Ungulate lineages proliferate into both grazers and browsers. social herding behaviors emerge as effective strategies. In open habitats, cursorial predators evolve limb elongation and refined locomotor efficiency. Proboscideans and rhinoceratoids and other large-bodied mammals become ecological architects. Their foraging and trampling reshape vegetation structure. Their dung recycles nutrients across landscapes. Their migrations link disparate biomes. In parallel, rodents explode numerically and taxonomically. Their small bodies, rapid reproduction and dental specializations make them ecological engineers and seed dispersers. Carnivoran lineages diversify. Both small ambush predators and large cursorial hunters, filling niches in the new savannas and woodlands. Cosmically minute events. Tectonic uplifts, the narrowing or opening of seaways, alter the stage. The uplift of mountain ranges changes rainfall patterns. Ocean currents reorganize. The global carbon cycle reroutes, and climate feedbacks oscillate between warmer and cooler phases. Each macro-physical adjustment funnels selection in particular directions. The tale of mammalian rise is thus not a single triumphant arc, but an accumulation of ecological openings and physiological predispositions reacting to shifting planetary parameters. The narrative pauses on a repeating motif of smallness that, in aggregate, carries enormous weight. One such image, a modest seed, falls into a newly opened patch of grassland, lodged beside a rodent burrow. Seasonally, insects visit the seed's developing plant. Small grazing mammals clip its leaves. Bird-like mammals, small and swift, take advantage of sheltering grasses. Over time, the plant community shifts. Soil structure changes. The burrow network modifies water infiltration. In a million such local episodes across continents, grasslands form, become resilient, and in turn promote new evolutionary experiments. Evidence for this deep time choreography comes from many lines: isotopic shifts in tooth enamel that record diets, pollen records that chart the spread of grasslands, tooth wear patterns that reveal abrasive diets, and molecular clocks that triangulate divergence times across lineages. The story emerges as an integration of many partial voices. Sediments, bones, chemical traces, assembled by careful, sometimes tentative inference. There is also a persistent ethical and emotional contour in how this chapter is told. The extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs remains a caution about contingency. Dramatic, rapid changes in planetary boundary conditions can abruptly erase long-standing and complex ecological arrangements. At the same time, the mammalian ascendancy illustrates a complementary truth. Extinction opens room for innovation. But the radiation of mammals was not inevitable. It was a contingent consequence of who survived, of which microhabitats persisted, and of the interplay between physiology and environment. The planet's ledger is not teleological. It is arithmetic folded into the shape of history. The end of the chapter returns to a single compressive image, a ritual the narrative has returned to before. A tiny, furred body in the dim light under a fallen log. The air is cool and full of the smell of wet earth. Ash from a distant residual fire lies in thin layers across the leaf litter. The creature pauses, nostrils flaring, eyes reflecting a pale light. It is neither heroic nor symbolic, beyond being an example of persistence. It forages on seeds. It hides its young in a shallow nest in the ground. In the immediate scale, its life is ordinary and precarious. In the long view, its descendants, through a relentless series of small, incremental changes, will come to occupy niches from alpine tundra to ocean depths to the canopies of tropical forests. The arc from that small body to the diversity of Cenozoic mammals is not a straight line of progress, but a braided stream of experiments, extinctions, and environmental changes. From 66 million years to the threshold of the Quaternary, the planet's surface is repeatedly remade by climate and tectonics, and mammal lineages endlessly test the new rules. Their rise is the story of filling emptied stages, of exploiting new resources, and of transforming ecosystems in turn. The lesson is twofold. Great change can be sudden and catastrophic, and yet, given time and persistence, life will find ways to explore the newly available spaces. The world remembers both the violence and the slow repair, and the ledger it keeps is written in teeth, in burrows, in coalified forests, and in the quiet persistence of a small creature beneath an ash-darkened sky. What if the most consequential thing in Earth's recent story was not a single invention, but a repetition of seasons pushed to extremes? Cold pressing in, warmth receding, habitats fragmenting and reconnecting like the breath of a living thing. This question opens the last long chapter, the Quaternary, the rhythms that begin roughly 6 million years ago and continue into the present. It is an epoch defined by oscillation, where the planet learned to switch climates as if flipping a slow planetary dial. And against that alternation, mammalian lineages both flourished and folded, and a particular primate lineage found ways to turn hardship into opportunity. The voice of deep time frames the era as a set of pulses. Glacials grew and receded. Ice sheets the size of continents advanced from polar zones into temperate latitudes, then melted back with a slowness that made single generations of animals feel like weather. Between these ice ages were interglacials, brief, balmy respites measured in tens of thousands of years, where forests crept poleward and megafauna dispersed. The narrative emphasis is not on a single temperature plot, but on the consequences of rhythm. Repeated fragmentation of habitats created isolated islands of evolution. Repeatable environmental stresses favored flexibility, migration, and innovation. Mammals, the planet's long-running experiment in warm-blooded endurance, responded in many ways. Some lineages enlarged, exploiting new resource economies. The proboscideans' elephant relatives, including the woolly mammoth that would later be familiar in frozen tundra, evolved heavy fur, fat deposits, and tusks that reshaped landscapes as they foraged. Horses, once browser dwellers in leafy forests, became grazers of open steppe. Their teeth lengthened and enamel thickened to cope with gritty, silica-rich grasses that accompanied the spread of cooler, drier climates. Whales, by contrast, told a different but parallel story of reinvention, a terrestrial mammal lineage that reverted to the sea, slowly transforming limbs into flippers, skulls into sonar-friendly shapes, and digestive systems into the engines of bulk feeding. These are not isolated curiosities, but repeated motifs, lineages that responded to shifting energetic regimes with morphological and behavioral experiments. Climate acted like a filter with a particularly blunt geometry. During glacial maxima, productive temperate forests retreated into refugia, small pockets of habitable landscape, while open, cold, tolerant ecosystems expanded. Populations that could migrate seasonally fared better. Those specialized for stable, localized resources suffered. The record in sediments and isotopes records these movements as much as bones do. Oxygen isotope ratios in deep-sea cores sketch the waxing and waning of ice. Pollen spectra in terrestrial deposits track the advance and retreat of forests. Paleosols and river terraces show where rivers slowed, shifted, or dried. These are the technical fingerprints of a world that repeatedly reorganized itself. The narrative dwells on thresholds, small changes in physiology or behavior that were decisive when climate amplified selection pressures. Hypsodonty in herbivores' high-crowned teeth emerged as grasslands spread, a dental innovation that made grazing on abrasive plants viable. Thick fur and insulating fat appeared repeatedly in northern lineages as winter severity deepened. Burrowing and torpor became strategies for coping with oscillating seasons. In each case, the story is not of instant invention, but of incremental adjustments, saved across many generations until a whole lineage appeared tailored to a new regime. Into this ecological theatre, and crucially shaped by it, hominins appeared, persisted, and eventually expanded their footprint. The Quaternary is sometimes called the dawn of humanity, not because humans immediately dominate, but because the slow pressures of climate created a problem space, where particular cognitive and social strategies had outsized payoffs. Early hominins, Australopithecines, then Homo habilis, and later Homo erectus, lived in environments of shifting mosaic, woodlands, gallery forests, open savannas, and riverine corridors appeared and disappeared. Those landscapes favored animals able to move, to exploit a range of resources, to manipulate objects, and to communicate about opportunities and dangers. Tools are one of the clearest archaeological registers of that adaptability. The earliest stoneflake technologies, simple but effective, did not announce a sudden genius so much as they recorded the repeated selection for object use. A sharp-edged flake could cut meat, strip a carcass, process tubers, or fashion shelter material. The behaviors that made and used these tools persist in the archaeological record for hundreds of thousands of years because they reliably increased nutritional returns. Fire, when harnessed and controlled, altered the energetics of life. Cooked calories are easier to digest. Warmth extends the usable hours in a cold landscape. Light extends vigilance. These are not plot devices, but selective advantages that accumulated across generations. Population dynamics and dispersal are central to this story. Hominins moved beyond their African origins in staggered waves. Small groups crossed ecological thresholds, deserts, seas, and mountain passes, entering new biomes where other selective pressures awaited. In Eurasia, some hominin branches encountered long-established cold-adapted fauna and, in different glacial cycles, adapted to open steppe environments. In each contact zone, the record preserves artifacts, hearths, and butchered bones that together sketch a slow expansion of presence rather than a sudden takeover. The voice of the narrative is careful with phrases like cognitive leap or language emergence. These are thresholds, inferred from converging lines of evidence: stone tool complexity, patterns of site reuse, transport of resources over distances, symbolic markings in late Pleistocene contexts. But they remain debates without neat timestamps. The documentary tone refrains from heroic stories of invention. Instead, it frames these capacities as cumulative possibilities that, under the pressures of mobility, social complexity, and resource unpredictability, were increasingly favored. Ecology and human behavior intersected in consequential ways. As hominins grew more adept hunters and gatherers, their activities rippled through food webs. Selective hunting of megafauna, giant herbivores adapted to the Pleistocene steppe and forest margins, put additional pressures on species already coping with climate change. The result, in many regions, was a pattern of synchronous extinction. Large-bodied mammals declined and often disappeared late in the Pleistocene. Whether the cause was climate, human predation, or an interaction of both remains a topic of active research. The narrator presents the evidence as convergent rather than decisive. In North America, South America, and Australia, the extinction of many large herbivores and predators coincides in time with increasing human presence. but in every case the pattern is modulated by local climate trends and ecological contexts. The longue durée of the Quaternary is punctuated not only by cold and warmth, but by human-induced accelerations in the last 10,000 years. Agriculture, domestication of plants and animals, began in multiple places as a set of local experiments in sedentism, storage, and crop selection. These changes rewired carbon cycles and land use locally and, over centuries and millennia, produced new feedbacks in soil formation, nutrient flows, and human demography. Villages aggregated into cities, which in turn linked across continents through trade and, later, through technologies that no single generation could have imagined. The story of humanity is, in the narrator's framing, a story of scale, small acts, selecting a seed, tending a herd, striking tinder, become amplifiers when performed millions of times across expanding networks of people. Throughout this account, the narrator returns to a principle emphasized earlier: contingency. The emergence of modern humans, the survival of certain mammal lineages, the particular timing of climatic oscillations, all are the result of multivariate chance. A slightly different configuration of ice sheet timing, a different volcanic event, a brain developmental mutation that did not occur. Any could have rerouted the trajectory. This is not fatalism, but a sober humility. The planet is not teleologically arranged for humans. Rather, a series of small advantages, iterated, produced a species capable of reflecting on these contingencies and, uniquely, altering planetary processes at scale. Evidence anchors the reconstruction at every step. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica record greenhouse gas levels and abrupt shifts in temperature. Pollen diagrams reveal vegetation response to millennial-scale oscillations. Stone tools, hearths, and cut-marked bones document hominin behavior. Genetic data, both ancient DNA and modern population genomics, illuminate migration routes, population bottlenecks, and admixture events such as interbreeding between Homo sapiens and other hominin groups in Eurasia. Each method is a dialect in a polyglot of evidence, and the narrator attends to the careful ways they corroborate and challenge one another. Emotion creeps into the voice, not as sentimentality, but as a reflective register. There is awe at the persistence of lineages across cycles of cold and warmth, at the ingenuity imprinted in stone and bone. And there is unease, a recognition that recent human actions have produced planetary consequences unprecedented in speed. The Quaternary ends with a scene in which the planet's rhythms are still audible. The cyclical advance of ice, the seasonal pulse of grass and herd, the migration corridors worn into the landscape. Then, overlaying those ancient cadences, are new rhythms, roads, cities, the hum of engines that alter the old feedbacks. As with every chapter in this long narrative, the ending compresses scale into an intimate image. Imagine a shallow meltwater pool on the edge of a receding glacier. Its surface is glassy under a low sun. At the water's edge, a single small footprint presses into the wet sediment, a heel strike, an arch, 5 slight impressions that speak of balance, bipedal gait, and the tactile negotiation of ground. Beside the print, a cracked flake of silicate shows a fresh edge, an instrument that will cut, scrape, shape a world by degrees. The footprint and the flake together are not dramatic in themselves, yet they are the nested signals of a species that would, through repetition and diffusion, come to impact the planet's chemistry, its land cover, and its climate. The dawn of humanity, in the narrator's voice, is thus not a triumphalist crescendo, but an intricate conditional melody. It is the story of mammals diversifying, elephants, equids, whales, and many more, of ice and warmth repeating their moods, and of a primate lineage that learned to think of tools not as accidents but as possibilities. It is a chapter of thresholds crossed and experiments tried, of extinctions and radiations, and of an emergent capacity for intentionality that now coexists with the deep, indifferent rhythms of Earth. The planet remains patient. The ledger of deep time keeps its quiet accounting. The final note is a reminder. Small acts, footsteps, flakes, seeds sown accumulate into histories that change the very conditions in which life can persist. What happens when a creature first learns that a loose stone can be made into an edge? That single practical insight, an accidental geometry of flake and striking force, becomes a hinge on which the planet's future will turn. It is an image both intimate and enormous, friction and care, thought and repetition. A hand that discovers it can extend itself into the world through objects. This is the idea that opens the final act of Earth's long story. The slow accretion of culture, symbol, and finally civilization from the grainy arithmetic of survival. Hands change the world before language names it. In shallow savannas and gallery forests, flexible thumbs and sensitive pads began to do what jaws and claws had done for other animals: manipulate matter. The precision grip thumb opposing finger allowed early hominins to hold a core steady, to strike with intention, to detach a sharp flake, and learn, by painful and patient trial, that a mere edge could open flesh, split bone, pare plant material, and shake wood. The voice of the deep past insists on the texture of that learning. Flint flakes glitter under a low sun. The smell of dust and heated stone hangs in the air. A new physiology, hands capable of contrivance, changes the economics of feeding and defense. Toolmaking is not mere technique, it is practice embedded in social life. Learning to nap is a pedagogy. Fingers guided by another set of fingers, eyes that mirror motion, a shared vocabulary of gestures before the vocabulary of sounds organizes. The repeated transmission of skill, how to strike, where to hold, how to judge a fracture, creates the first durable culture. Over generations, such skills become more than survival tricks. They become repositories of memory, handed down in apprenticeship that is both bodily and communal. The narrator lingers on the sensual detail, calloused thumbs, the metallic tang of old stone, the rhythm of flaking like a language of its own. That language emerges in stages. Vocalization and gesture move from alarm shrieks and affiliative grunts to combinatorial, repeatable patterns that carry more than immediate meaning. The thick sociality required for cooperative hunting, for sharing fat and marrow, for caring for dependent young, applies selection pressure not only on hands but on ears and brains. A more precise system of signals, words in embryo, enables planning for the future, for the delayed returns of stalking a herd for hours, for hiding and returning with meat. The narrator does not write myths about the first word. Instead, the account describes the architecture of possibility. Recursive communication facilitates coordination. Coordination opens new foraging economies. New economies permit longer childhoods and thus more time for learning and brain development. Language is not a sudden miracle. It is a cumulative scaffold that allows information to leave bodies and persist in the minds of others. As symbolic behavior grows, externalizations of memory and meaning appear. A smear of ochre on a cave wall, a carefully arranged pile of bones, a bead pierced and strung. Each is testimony that a world of thought has begun to reach beyond the immediate. Art and ritual are ways of binding groups together, of making ephemeral feelings into durable marks. These marks are both practical mapping seasons, encoding knowledge of edible plants, and existential, conveying grief, desire, and shared cosmologies. The narrator dwells on the curious intimacy of this work. pigment rubbing across skin, fingers tracing a pattern that will survive damp centuries in sheltered rock, hands insisting that private thoughts become communal inscriptions. Domestication rewrites the relationship between people and the landscape. The first intentional sowings, choosing a seed, scratching soil, pacing rows, are small acts of temporal projection. Planting anticipates seasons yet to come. It ties effort now to deferred harvest. Animal domestication follows a parallel logic. The close presence of certain species rewires mobility, diet, and storage. Sedentism emerges not as a single invention, but as a collective opt-in. Storage allows surplus. Surplus allows larger groups and specialized labor. Specialization allows innovative crafts. Villages become nodes of exchange, and exchange is the medium by which technical knowledge, metallurgy, pottery, textile craft accumulates and diversifies. The first written signs are a radical intensification of external memory. Where oral traditions moved slowly, writing allows commitments to travel across space and time with unprecedented fidelity. A carved mark on damp clay, impressed with a reed stylus, becomes a ledger, grain weights, debts, sacred incantations. Writing is bureaucratic at its inception, practical accounting for surpluses. But its consequence is philosophical. It permits planned infrastructure, long-distance governance, treaties, and histories whose threads are not wholly at the mercy of human memory. The narrator emphasizes the feel of clay under the thumb, the scratch of reed, the cool weight of a token sensory cues that tie the abstract business of record-keeping to tactile, embodied practices. Cities are the planet's new organs, dense congregations of people, goods, information, and waste. Streets amplify the possibilities of trade. Markets condense innovation. Markets feed fiscal and political systems that scale social coordination beyond kinship. The soundscape of a city call to market, hammer on anvil, animal bleat, the hush of a scholar reading a tablet becomes a new kind of ecology. Urban life accelerates technological recombination. Metallurgy blossoms, long-distance navigation refines, seafaring, astronomy organizes calendars and rites, and mathematics abstracts the world into operations manipulable across generations. At this scale, cognition begins to be externalized not only in marks on clay, but in institutions. Laws, religious hierarchies, schools, and libraries that store and curate collective knowledge. The industrial turn is a sudden amplification of energies that had been accumulating for millennia. The harnessing of fossilized carbon as machine fuel creates a discontinuity in rates of production, transport, and ecological impact that past societies had not experienced. Smoke and iron change skylines and air, steam and later electricity reshape the daily tempo of millions. The narrator frames this as both technical innovation and planetary reconfiguration. Energy flows, once tied to sunlight and photosynthesis, are now mediated by subterranean stores, compacted over deep time. This is an ironic convergence. The bodies and societies that emerge from carbon-sequestering forests now release that carbon in vast quantities in short geological noise. The consequences ripple in climate, ocean chemistry, and a cascade of ecological adjustments. Scientific thought reframes humanity's relationship to the planet. Geology opens the record of deep time. Astronomy situates Earth among many worlds. Biology reconstructs lineages and common threads between life forms. These intellectual revolutions are not mere abstractions. They alter the way a species plans, values the future, and imagines responsibility. Knowing the fragility of ice sheets, the inertia of greenhouse warming, the millennial persistence of carbon in the atmosphere changes political horizons. The narrator treats this knowledge with neither triumph nor despair, but as a new tool, the capacity to imagine consequences at planetary scales and to act, however imperfectly, on that imagination. Speculation is part of the human habit of mind, and deep time invites speculative hypotheses about possibilities that leave no obvious trace. Might there have been previous civilizations whose material signatures have been erased by erosion, subduction, or simple time? The narrator treats such propositions carefully. Geology is both generous and ruthless. It preserves some archives, mineral concentrations, buried city-states in alluvial plains, abrupt isotopic signatures, while it obliterates others under mountain building, glaciation, and the slow reworking of crust. The possibility of an advanced society in deep antiquity cannot be casually affirmed nor dismissed. It serves, in this narrative, less as a literal claim than as a reminder. The absence of evidence is not proof of absence, and the permanency of any human artifact is far less durable than human imagination assumes. Cities sink in deltas, records decompose, alloys oxidize, and the planet does what it has always done: recycle matter on geologic timescales. That recycling is both humility and a call to care. Intelligence confers capacities, the ability to redirect rivers, breed crops, build machines that fly beyond the atmosphere and peer into the deep past. But intelligence also introduces new modes of failure. Collective actions can produce global perturbations. Climate warming, species extinction, ocean acidification that outpace the capacity of ecosystems and social institutions to adapt. The narrator frames this as an ethical threshold rather than a moral condemnation. A species that can alter the planet also inherits the duty to understand the consequences of that alteration. The story converges on a paradox as old as Earth's earliest chemistry: small things matter. A microbial mat-tracked sediment, a raindrop-dissolved mineral, a hand held a flake, a reed stylus incised a tablet. Each was a small, repeated event whose cumulative effects changed the planet's state. Modern societies amplify that arithmetic: billions of choices, what to burn, where to build, which ideologies to spread, compound into planetary scale outcomes. The narrator asks the listener to feel both the smallness of individual acts and the sweeping consequences of collective behavior, without scolding and without absolution. If the narrative looks forward, it must also look inward. Intelligence produces a new kind of reflection: the capacity to narrate one's origins. The same species that learned to make tools also learned to tell stories about making tools. It could use its language to translate hand gestures into myths, then into theories, and finally into data. This reflexivity is unique, not because thought alone is rare in nature, but because it became linked to technologies that preserve and amplify thought across space and time. Writing, printing, digital storage. Humans are now both actors and historians in Earth's book, able to examine the drafts and redrafts of their planet's biography and to imagine alternative futures with a clarity never before possible. What, then, might be the final image? In a long story of flares and glaciers, of stromatolites and coal seams, the narrator returns to a modest, compressive detail, an act that joins the earliest toolmaker to the modern engineer. Imagine a thumb, smudged with soot and clay, pressing an impression into wet clay. The thumbprint holds whorls and ridges that are the biology of the individual. The clay is the medium of inscription. The mark becomes cache and label, ownership and record. That thumbprint could be in a hunter's hearthside pot, a clay token recording grain weights, a seal pressed on a merchant's tablet, or a fingerprint on a smartphone screen. Across epochs, the material changes, the medium adapts, but the gesture, the mark that says, "I was here, this matters," remains the same. From a single filament of life in the dim ocean, through membranes and mats, through the rise of photosynthesis and the long patient grinding of plates, through reptiles and mammals and the paces of ice, the planet has become a stage for a species that can look back and narrate. That capacity is neither a victory lap nor a verdict. It is simply another condition of being in a world that remains indifferent in its physics and prodigal in its possibilities. The final note the narrator leaves is an invitation to hold the sense of smallness, one thumbprint among billions in the mud of history, and to use that humility as the ground for deliberate action. To remember that intelligence, unlike many geological forces, can choose foresight, that the same hands that knapped flint can also press clay in careful record-keeping for future beings, and that such choices will determine whether the ledger of Earth's next chapters is written in flourishing diversity or in fewer, poorer lines. The continent-sized dramas of plate tectonics and the microscopic dramas of lipid membranes are not rival stories but the same archive told at different scales. In the end, the planet that began as a cloud of dust and a molten sphere has become a planet capable of telling its own history. That narration is imperfect and partial, but it is real. The last image, then, is small and human-scaled. A thumbprint dark with coal dust or soot pressed into wet clay beside a catalogue of grain weights. It is a mark that says both, "This was done," and "Remember," a tiny tactile contract between the present and the future, between short-term need and long-term care. In that smudge the deep-time voice finds a closing symmetry, from atoms forged in ancient stars to impressions left by a single thumb. Earth's story moves between the infinitesimal and the immense, and intelligence, for all its novelty, remains an instrument of both creation and responsibility.